Hello everyone, welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm here tonight to tell you about a case that shows us how justice, though sometimes delayed, never truly dies. This is the story of how cutting-edge science finally caught up with a killer who thought he'd gotten away with murder for over 3 decades. So find your comfortable spot, dim the lights, and let me take you through the remarkable case of Sandra Martinez and the breakthrough that changed everything in 2024. It was December 15, 1993, in the quiet suburb of Riverside, California. Sandra Martinez was 26 years old, working as a dental hygienist at a small practice downtown. She lived alone in a tidy apartment complex called Oakwood Gardens, known for its well-maintained grounds and sense of community. Sandra was the kind of person who made an impression. Her colleagues remember her infectious laugh that would echo through the dental office. She had this habit of humming while she worked, usually old Beatles songs that her father had played throughout her childhood. Her patients loved her gentle touch and the way she'd distract them from their anxiety with stories about her weekend hiking adventures in the San Bernardino Mountains. She'd moved to Riverside 3 years earlier from Phoenix, following a job opportunity and a desire for a fresh start after a difficult breakup. Sandra had quickly made friends in her new city. She joined a local book club, volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends, and had recently started dating a fellow named Michael Torres, who worked at the local community college. That December evening started like any other Tuesday for Sandra. She finished work at 5:30 p.m., stopped by Vaughn's grocery store to pick up ingredients for dinner. She was planning to try a new pasta recipe she'd found in one of her cooking magazines. The cashier, who knew Sandra as a regular customer, later told police they'd chatted about the upcoming holidays and Sandra's plans to visit her family in Phoenix for Christmas. Security cameras captured Sandra leaving the store at 6:42 p.m., carrying 2 brown paper bags and smiling at something on her phone, likely a text message, though this was back in the early days of cell phones, when they were still quite basic. What happened next would remain a mystery for 31 years. Sandra never made it home that night. When she failed to show up for work the next morning without calling, something completely out of character for her, her supervisor, Dr. Patricia Williams, became concerned. Sandra was remarkably reliable, never missing work without notice in her 3 years at the practice. Dr. Williams called Sandra's apartment, but there was no answer. She tried several more times throughout the morning, growing increasingly worried. During her lunch break, she drove to Oakwood Gardens and knocked on Sandra's door. Still no response. The apartment manager, after some persuasion, agreed to do a welfare check. They found Sandra's car parked in her designated spot, the groceries still in the back seat, now spoiled from sitting overnight in the December heat that Southern California sometimes experiences. But Sandra was nowhere to be found. The Riverside Police Department responded quickly when Dr. Williams reported Sandra missing. Detective James Holbrook, a 15-year veteran of the force, took the lead on the case. He was known for his thoroughness and his ability to see patterns that others missed. The initial investigation revealed troubling details. Sandra's apartment showed no signs of forced entry, but there were subtle signs of disturbance. A lamp was knocked over, there were scuff marks on the hardwood floor near the entryway, and strangely, Sandra's purse was found on the kitchen counter with her wallet intact, money and credit cards untouched. Detective Holbrook interviewed Sandra's co-workers, friends, and recent acquaintances. Everyone painted the same picture: Sandra was cautious, responsible, and had no known enemies. Her ex-boyfriend in Phoenix had a solid alibi, he was at work with dozens of witnesses. Michael Torres, her new boyfriend, had been at a faculty meeting until 8 p.m. that night, also with multiple witnesses. The grocery store's security footage was crucial. It showed Sandra walking to her car normally, placing the bags in the back seat, and driving away. But here's where things became puzzling: the camera angle couldn't capture the entire parking lot, leaving a blind spot where something could have happened without being recorded. 3 days into the investigation, a jogger found Sandra's keys in some bushes about half a mile from her apartment complex. They were thrown there, not dropped. The distance from the walking path made that clear. Detective Holbrook knew this wasn't a random crime. Someone had taken Sandra, and they'd been careful about it. The search expanded. Volunteers from Sandra's church, co-workers, and neighbors joined law enforcement in combing through local parks, vacant lots, and the rural areas outside Riverside. They found nothing. A week passed. Then 2 weeks. The trail was growing cold, but Detective Holbrook refused to give up. He expanded the search radius, contacted hospitals and morgues in neighboring counties, and worked with federal authorities to check if Sandra might have crossed state lines, willingly or otherwise. On January 3, 1994, 18 days after Sandra disappeared, a construction crew working on a new housing development in Moreno Valley, about 12 miles from Riverside, made a grim discovery. They were excavating for the foundation of what would become someone's dream home when they uncovered human remains. The Riverside County Coroner's Office worked carefully to exhume and examine the remains. Dental records confirmed what Detective Holbrook had feared: they had found Sandra Martinez. The coroner determined that Sandra had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The attack had been violent and personal. But here's what made the case even more troubling: evidence suggested that Sandra had been held somewhere for several hours before she was killed. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or passion. Someone had planned this. At the crime scene, investigators found something that would prove crucial decades later: a small piece of fabric caught on a branch near where Sandra's body was discovered. It appeared to be from a work shirt or jacket, and it had what looked like blood on it. In 1994, DNA technology existed but was in its infancy. The sample was carefully preserved, but the technology to make use of it wouldn't come for years. Detective Holbrook worked the case tirelessly. He followed up on hundreds of tips, interviewed dozens of people, and pursued every lead, no matter how small. But without physical evidence linking anyone to the crime, the case eventually went cold. For 30 years, Sandra Martinez's case sat in a file cabinet at the Riverside Police Department. Detective Holbrook retired in 2008, but not before training his replacement, Detective Maria Santos, on all the details of Sandra's case. He made her promise to never let Sandra be forgotten. Detective Santos kept that promise. Every few years, she would pull out Sandra's file and review it with fresh eyes. She re-interviewed key witnesses as technology and techniques evolved. She had the evidence re-examined multiple times as forensic science advanced. Sandra's family never gave up hope either. Her parents, Roberto and Carmen Martinez, held annual memorial services at their church in Phoenix. They started a small scholarship fund in Sandra's name for students pursuing careers in healthcare, honoring their daughter's compassionate nature. Carmen Martinez, Sandra's mother, became an advocate for families of missing persons. She worked with local law enforcement agencies to improve protocols for missing person cases and pushed for better funding for cold case investigations. She often said that Sandra's spirit was driving her to help other families avoid the pain and uncertainty they'd endured. The case received periodic media attention over the years. Local news stations would run features on the anniversary of Sandra's disappearance. True crime bloggers occasionally wrote about the case, trying to generate new leads. But nothing substantial emerged. What the family and investigators didn't know was that the answer had been sitting in an evidence locker all along, waiting for science to catch up. In 2015, the Riverside Police Department began partnering with outside labs to re-examine old evidence using advanced DNA techniques. Sandra's case was among dozens selected for this initiative. The piece of fabric found near her body was sent to a specialized laboratory for analysis. The initial results were promising but incomplete. They were able to extract a partial DNA profile from the fabric, enough to know it belonged to a male, but not enough to run through the national DNA database system called CODIS, combined DNA index system, for a match. The partial profile sat in the system for years, waiting for either a match or better technology. Then, in 2023, everything changed with the advent of advanced forensic genetic genealogy, the same technology that had helped solve dozens of other cold cases across the country. This new approach didn't just compare DNA to criminal databases. It could compare the unknown DNA to the genetic profiles of millions of people who had voluntarily submitted their DNA to ancestry websites, looking for family connections that could lead investigators to a suspect. In March 2024, Detective Santos, now a seasoned investigator with 16 years on the force, received a call that would change everything. The lab had found a potential match. Dr. Rebecca Chen from the Othram Laboratory in Texas was the forensic genealogist who cracked the case. She'd been working on Sandra's DNA profile for 3 months, building family trees and following genetic breadcrumbs through generations of ancestry data. The process is painstaking and requires incredible patience. Dr. Chen started with the partial DNA profile from the fabric and used advanced techniques to extract more genetic information than had been possible in previous decades. She then uploaded this enhanced profile to genetic genealogy databases, looking for relatives, even distant ones. The first breakthrough came when she found a match to someone who shared great-great-grandparents with the unknown suspect. From there, Dr. Chen began building a massive family tree, working both forward and backward through generations, identifying hundreds of potential descendants. The work required not just scientific expertise but also detective skills. Dr. Chen had to research birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and census data. She had to track family migrations, name changes, and adoptions. It was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle with thousands of pieces, most of which seemed to fit nowhere. After weeks of genealogical detective work, Dr. Chen narrowed the possibilities down to 3 potential suspects, 3 men who were the right age, lived in the area during the time of Sandra's murder, and fit the genetic profile. Detective Santos took over from there. She began investigating each of the 3 men quietly, carefully. The first suspect had died in 2019, but had a solid alibi for the night of Sandra's disappearance. He'd been in the hospital recovering from surgery, with medical records to prove it. The second suspect had moved to Oregon in 1995 and had no connection to Sandra or her life. Detective Santos traveled to Oregon to interview him and quickly determined he wasn't their man. The third suspect was Thomas Wayne Mitchell, age 58, still living in Riverside County. And when Detective Santos began researching his background, pieces started falling into place in a way that gave her chills. In December 1993, Thomas Mitchell had been 27 years old, working as a maintenance supervisor for a company that serviced several businesses in Riverside, including the shopping center where Sandra had bought her groceries that final night. Mitchell had access to that shopping center after hours. He knew the area well, including the back entrances and the spots not covered by security cameras. His work truck had been seen in the area on multiple occasions, so its presence wouldn't have seemed unusual to anyone. But here's what made Detective Santos's pulse quicken. Thomas Mitchell had a history of violence against women that had somehow never resulted in serious charges. In 1991, he'd been arrested for stalking an ex-girlfriend, but charges were dropped when she moved out of state and declined to testify. In 1995, he'd been questioned in connection with another attack on a woman in a parking lot, but was released due to lack of evidence. Most significantly, Mitchell's employment records showed that he'd abruptly quit his job in January 1994, just days after Sandra's body was discovered, claiming he needed to move out of state to care for a sick relative. But Detective Santos's research showed no evidence of any sick relative. Mitchell had simply disappeared from Riverside for several years. The more Detective Santos learned about Thomas Mitchell, the more convinced she became that they'd found Sandra's killer. Detective Santos knew that genetic genealogy evidence alone wouldn't be enough to convict Thomas Mitchell. She needed to build a comprehensive case that would stand up in court. She began a careful surveillance operation, gathering evidence and watching Mitchell's current behavior patterns. What she discovered was deeply disturbing. Mitchell, now in his late 50s, was still working in maintenance, this time for a property management company that oversaw several apartment complexes in the area. He had access to hundreds of apartments, most of them occupied by young women living alone. Detective Santos quietly reached out to tenants in Mitchell's buildings. She discovered a pattern of complaints about him that building management had largely ignored. Several women reported that Mitchell had entered their apartments for repairs that seemed unnecessary. Others mentioned feeling uncomfortable around him, describing him as someone who stood too close and made inappropriate comments. One tenant, a 24-year-old graduate student named Ashley Kumar, provided information that made Detective Santos's blood run cold. Mitchell had been showing up at Ashley's apartment frequently over the past month, claiming various maintenance issues needed addressing. Ashley had started staying with friends because Mitchell made her so uncomfortable, but she'd been afraid to file a formal complaint for fear of retaliation. Detective Santos realized they might be dealing with someone who was still actively predatory. The urgency of the case intensified. Working with the district attorney's office, Detective Santos developed a strategy to gather additional evidence. They obtained warrants to search Mitchell's current residence and his work vehicle. They also secured permission to collect a direct DNA sample from Mitchell himself. The search was planned carefully. On April 15, 2024, at 6 a.m., Detective Santos and a team of officers executed the warrant at Mitchell's small house in Moreno Valley, ironically, just a few miles from where Sandra's body had been found 30 years earlier. Mitchell answered the door in his pajamas, seemingly confused by the early morning visit. He was polite and cooperative, which Detective Santos found interesting. In her experience, truly innocent people tended to be more upset or indignant when faced with a search warrant. The search of Mitchell's house revealed items that seemed to confirm their suspicions. In a closet, they found a collection of newspaper clippings about Sandra's case, carefully preserved in a scrapbook. Mitchell had been following the investigation for 30 years, keeping track of every development, every anniversary article. They also found what appeared to be trophies from other crimes, items of women's jewelry that didn't seem to belong to anyone Mitchell had been in relationships with. Each piece was carefully labeled with dates and locations, suggesting a methodical, organized predator. In Mitchell's garage, they discovered work clothes from the 1990s that he'd never thrown away. One jacket showed signs of being repaired where fabric had been torn away, consistent with the piece found at Sandra's crime scene. But the most damning evidence came from Mitchell's own behavior during the search. When officers asked him about Sandra Martinez, Mitchell's demeanor changed completely. He became nervous, started sweating, and began telling an elaborate story about how he'd heard about that case and felt sorry for the family. No one had mentioned how Sandra died or any details about the case. Mitchell shouldn't have known anything beyond what was in public reports. But he let slip details that had never been released to the media, including the fact that Sandra had been held somewhere before being killed. Detective Santos knew they had their man. The direct DNA sample from Thomas Mitchell came back as a perfect match to the evidence found at Sandra's crime scene. On May 2, 2024, Detective Santos arrested him for the murder of Sandra Martinez. The arrest took place at Mitchell's workplace. Detective Santos wanted to take him into custody in a controlled environment, away from his home where he might have weapons or other means of escape. She'd learned from 30 years of police work that the most dangerous moment in any case is often the arrest itself. Mitchell didn't resist. In fact, he seemed almost relieved when Detective Santos read him his rights. After being transported to the Riverside Police Department, he asked for a lawyer but then, surprisingly, said he wanted to make a statement first. What happened next was something Detective Santos had hoped for but never expected. Thomas Mitchell, after 30 years of carrying his secret, decided to confess. His confession was detailed and disturbing. Mitchell explained that he'd been watching Sandra for weeks before the attack. He'd noticed her routine, her shopping trips, her work schedule, her patterns. He'd developed what he called an obsession with her. On the night of December 15, 1993, Mitchell had been working late at the shopping center when he saw Sandra leaving the grocery store. He followed her to the parking lot and confronted her, initially claiming there was a problem with her car that he could help fix. When Sandra politely declined his help and tried to leave, Mitchell became aggressive. He forced her into his work van, telling her he just wanted to talk, that he'd been trying to work up the courage to ask her out. Mitchell held Sandra in an abandoned storage facility that his company used for equipment. He claimed he kept telling himself he was going to let her go, that he just wanted to spend time with her. But Sandra fought back, trying to escape, and in Mitchell's words, everything went wrong. The confession was horrific in its detail, but it finally provided Sandra's family with answers they'd been seeking for 3 decades. Mitchell also admitted to several other attacks on women over the years, crimes that had gone unsolved or unreported. Detective Santos felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness as she processed Mitchell's confession. Justice for Sandra was finally within reach, but it couldn't bring back the 30 years her family had lost, wondering and hoping. Thomas Wayne Mitchell pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in the death of Sandra Martinez on August 14, 2024. In exchange for his confession and guilty plea, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentencing hearing was emotional and powerful. Sandra's parents, now in their 80s, were able to attend and finally hear the answers they'd been seeking for 31 years. Carmen Martinez, Sandra's mother, read a victim impact statement that brought tears to everyone in the courtroom. She spoke about the daughter they'd lost, not just to murder, but to the uncertainty that followed. She talked about birthdays celebrated with an empty chair, holidays shadowed by questions, and the exhaustion of hoping for news while fearing what that news might be. But Carmen also spoke about finding peace. "We can finally say goodbye to our Sandra properly," she said. "We can finally let her rest, knowing that the person who took her away from us will never hurt another family the way he hurt ours." Detective Maria Santos, who had worked Sandra's case for 16 years, was recognized by the department for her dedication. But she deflected the praise, saying that Sandra herself had guided the investigation. "Cold cases are never really cold," she said at the press conference. "The victims are always there, waiting for us to find the answers." The case also led to policy changes in how apartment management companies screen and supervise maintenance workers. Ashley Kumar, the graduate student who had felt threatened by Mitchell, testified before the city council about the need for better protections for tenants, particularly young women living alone. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the forensic genealogist who cracked the case, went on to solve dozens of other cold cases using similar techniques. She often spoke about Sandra's case as an example of how science and persistence can finally bring justice, even after decades. The technology that solved Sandra's case, forensic genetic genealogy, has revolutionized cold case investigations across the country. Hundreds of families have found answers to questions they'd carried for years or even decades. But for all the scientific advances and investigative techniques, Sandra's case ultimately came down to something simpler: people who refused to give up. Detective Holbrook, who started the investigation. Detective Santos, who carried it forward. Dr. Chen, who found the genetic key. And Sandra's family, who never stopped believing that someday, somehow, they would know the truth. As I finish Sandra's story tonight, I think about the power of persistence and the importance of never giving up on justice. Sandra Martinez was 26 years old when her life was cut short by someone who thought he could get away with murder. For 31 years, it seemed like he might be right. But Sandra's story shows us that some secrets are too heavy to carry forever. The truth has a way of surfacing, sometimes with the help of science we couldn't have imagined, sometimes through the dedication of people who refuse to let the forgotten stay forgotten. Thomas Mitchell is now serving life in prison, spending his final years knowing that his crimes finally caught up with him. The families of his other victims, crimes that came to light after his confession, also have their answers now. Sandra's parents have found the peace that comes with knowing. They've established a foundation in Sandra's name that provides funding for cold case investigations and supports families of missing persons. Her legacy lives on in every case that gets solved, every family that finds closure, every person who refuses to let a victim be forgotten. The next time you hear about a cold case being solved by DNA evidence, remember Sandra Martinez. Remember that behind every breakthrough is a victim who deserved justice, a family that deserved answers, and investigators who refused to give up. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes, it just takes science, persistence, and time for the truth to finally come to light. Please, I'm putting it out there, if you're still awake listening to this story and haven't subscribed, please consider supporting my channel. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions are what fuel my content creation. Let's build a community together. Also, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Now let's move on to our next story. Story 2. Tonight I want to tell you a story about patience, perseverance, and the power of never giving up on justice. It's a story that spans nearly half a century, from a tragic night in 1979 to a courtroom victory in 2024. This is the story of 17-year-old Esther Gonzalez, a young woman whose life was brutally cut short on a mountain highway in Riverside County, California. For 45 years, her killer walked free while her family lived with unanswered questions and unresolved grief. But in 2024, advances in DNA technology and the dedication of cold case investigators finally brought the truth to light. Tonight, we'll walk through every chapter of this remarkable case, from the horrific crime that shocked a small mountain community in 1979, through decades of frustration and dead ends, to the moment when science and determination finally converged to identify Louis Randy Williamson as Esther's killer. This is a story about how justice can be delayed but never truly denied. It's about how families carry the weight of loss for decades, never knowing if they'll ever get answers. And it's about how modern forensic science can reach back through time to solve crimes that once seemed unsolvable. So settle in, close your eyes, and let me take you back to 1979, to a dark stretch of Highway 243 in the San Bernardino Mountains, where a young woman's life ended and a mystery began that would take nearly 5 decades to solve. To understand what happened to Esther Gonzalez, we need to first understand the place where her story tragically ended. Highway 243 winds through the San Bernardino Mountains of Southern California, a scenic route that connects the desert communities of the Coachella Valley with the mountain towns of Idlewild and Banning. In 1979, this stretch of highway was more isolated than it is today. There were fewer homes, fewer businesses, and far fewer people traveling the winding mountain roads after dark. The area was known for its natural beauty, towering pine trees, granite outcroppings, and sweeping views of the valleys below. But that same isolation that made it beautiful also made it dangerous for anyone who found themselves alone and vulnerable on these remote roads. The highway itself is a 2-lane road that curves and climbs through the mountains, with steep drop-offs on one side and rocky hillsides on the other. At night, especially in the late 1970s before modern lighting and safety improvements, it could be a treacherous drive even for experienced local drivers. For someone unfamiliar with the area, or for someone in distress, it could be terrifying. Esther Gonzalez was 17 years old in February 1979, a young woman on the cusp of adulthood with her whole life ahead of her. She was the kind of teenager who should have been worrying about high school classes, weekend plans with friends, and maybe her first serious boyfriend. Instead, on February 9, 1979, she found herself on this dark mountain highway in circumstances that remain partly mysterious even today. What we know is that Esther didn't choose to be on Highway 243 that night. She wasn't out for a scenic drive or heading to visit friends in the mountains. Instead, she was there because someone had taken her there, someone who intended to do her harm. The area where Esther's body was eventually found was particularly isolated, off the main highway, down an embankment, in a spot where she might not have been discovered for weeks or even months if not for a chance encounter by someone passing by. This wasn't a random location chosen in panic. It was a place selected by someone who knew the area, someone who understood how to hide a crime. The remoteness of the location would prove to be both a blessing and a curse for investigators. On one hand, it limited the number of potential witnesses and made it harder to establish a timeline of events. On the other hand, it suggested that whoever killed Esther was familiar with these mountain roads, which could help narrow down the pool of suspects. In 1979, forensic science was in its infancy compared to what we have today. DNA analysis was still years away from being used in criminal investigations. Fingerprints, blood typing, and witness testimony were the primary tools available to detectives working homicide cases. When those tools didn't provide clear answers, cases could go unsolved for years or even decades. But the investigators who responded to Esther's murder scene did their best with the tools they had. They carefully documented the crime scene, collected what physical evidence was available, and began the painstaking process of trying to reconstruct what had happened to this young woman on that dark February night. Esther Gonzalez was more than just a victim of a violent crime. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a young woman with dreams and aspirations that would never be fulfilled. Understanding who Esther was as a person is crucial to understanding the impact of her death and the determination that would drive investigators to never give up on finding her killer. At 17, Esther was navigating that complex transition from childhood to adulthood that defines the teenage years. She was old enough to have developed her own personality, her own interests, and her own plans for the future, but still young enough to be vulnerable in ways that more experienced adults might not be. Those who knew Esther remember her as a typical teenager of the late 1970s, a time when young people had more freedom than they might today, when it wasn't uncommon for teenagers to hitchhike or accept rides from people they didn't know well. It was an era before cell phones, before the constant connectivity that allows parents to check on their children's whereabouts at any moment. Esther lived in an age when young people relied on their wits, their instincts, and sometimes the kindness of strangers to navigate the world. Unfortunately, it was also an age when that same trust and vulnerability could be exploited by those with evil intentions. The circumstances that brought Esther to Highway 243 on February 9, 1979, remain somewhat unclear even today. What we know is that she didn't drive herself there, she was either taken there against her will or convinced to go there by someone she may have trusted. This detail would prove crucial to understanding the crime and eventually identifying the perpetrator. Esther's family was devastated by her death. Losing a child is every parent's worst nightmare, but losing a child to violence, with no immediate answers about who was responsible, creates a special kind of hell that few people can truly understand. The Gonzalez family found themselves thrust into a world of police investigations, crime scene reports, and constant media attention, all while trying to process their overwhelming grief. In the days and weeks following Esther's murder, her family did everything they could to help investigators solve the case. They provided detailed information about Esther's friends, her activities, her routines, and anyone who might have had contact with her in the days before her death. They cooperated with police interviews, they allowed searches of their home and Esther's belongings, and they held on to hope that someone would be arrested soon. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, that hope began to fade. The initial burst of investigative activity slowed down as leads dried up and detectives were assigned to newer cases. The media attention moved on to other stories. The community's shock and outrage gradually gave way to the routine concerns of daily life. For the Gonzalez family, however, there was no moving on. Every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering was marked by Esther's absence. Every news report about other solved murder cases was a reminder that their daughter's killer was still out there, free to live his life while theirs remained frozen in grief and uncertainty. The impact of Esther's death extended beyond her immediate family. Her friends struggled with survivor's guilt and the terrifying realization that something similar could happen to them. Her classmates graduated from high school knowing that one of their own would never have that experience. Her community was forced to confront the reality that violent crime could happen anywhere, even in the seemingly safe mountain communities of Southern California. The investigation into Esther Gonzalez's murder began immediately after her body was discovered on that February morning in 1979. Riverside County Sheriff's detectives responded to the scene with the urgency that all homicide cases demand, knowing that the first 48 hours are crucial for gathering evidence and identifying suspects. The crime scene itself told a story, but it was a story with many missing pages. Esther's body had been left off Highway 243, in a location that suggested the killer was familiar with the area. The positioning of her body, the condition of her clothing, and other details that investigators kept private all provided clues about what had happened to her and what kind of person might have been responsible. Detectives immediately began canvassing the area, looking for anyone who might have seen something suspicious on the night of February 9th or in the early morning hours of February 10th. They checked with local businesses, gas stations, and residents along the highway, hoping to find someone who had noticed an unfamiliar vehicle or observed someone acting strangely. The 1970s were a different era for criminal investigations. There were no security cameras on every corner, no cell phone records to analyze, no GPS data to track vehicle movements. Investigators had to rely on old-fashioned detective work, talking to people, following up on tips, and carefully analyzing the physical evidence available at the scene. One of the first challenges investigators faced was establishing Esther's movements in the hours before her death. Where had she been? Who had she been with? How had she ended up on that remote stretch of highway? These basic questions, which might be relatively easy to answer today with digital surveillance and electronic records, required extensive legwork in 1979. Detectives interviewed Esther's family members, friends, classmates, and anyone else who might have had contact with her in the days before her death. They created timelines, mapped out her known activities, and tried to identify any gaps where she might have encountered her killer. The physical evidence from the scene was carefully collected and analyzed using the best forensic techniques available at the time. Blood samples were typed, fingerprints were collected and compared against known databases, and any other trace evidence was preserved for future analysis. Even in 1979, investigators understood that cases sometimes weren't solved immediately, and evidence that seemed insignificant at the time might prove crucial years later. One of the most frustrating aspects of the investigation was the lack of clear witnesses. The remote location where Esther was found meant that there were few people around who might have seen what happened. The darkness of the February night and the winding nature of the mountain highway made it difficult for even those who might have been in the area to see clearly or remember specific details. Investigators also had to consider the possibility that Esther's killer was someone she knew. Statistics show that many murder victims are killed by someone familiar to them, a family member, friend, acquaintance, or romantic partner. Detectives carefully examined Esther's relationships, looking for anyone who might have had a motive to harm her or who had exhibited concerning behavior. As weeks passed without an arrest, the investigation began to slow down. Detectives followed up on hundreds of tips from the public, but none led to a definitive suspect. They re-interviewed witnesses, hoping that someone might remember an additional detail that could break the case open. They expanded their canvas to include people who lived or worked in areas farther from the crime scene, thinking that the killer might have traveled from a greater distance. The lack of progress was frustrating for everyone involved, the investigators who had devoted countless hours to the case, the family who desperately wanted answers, and the community that wanted to see justice served. But homicide detectives understand that not every case is solved quickly, and they continued to work the case even as other priorities demanded their attention. As 1979 turned into 1980, and then into 1981, the Esther Gonzalez case gradually transformed from an active investigation into what law enforcement calls a cold case. This doesn't mean that investigators gave up or stopped caring, it simply means that all the immediate leads had been exhausted, and the case would require new information or new techniques to move forward. For the Gonzalez family, this transition was particularly painful. The daily phone calls from detectives stopped. The sense of urgency that had characterized the early weeks of the investigation gave way to the routine of normal police work. Other cases demanded attention, other families needed justice, and the resources that had been focused on Esther's murder were necessarily redirected to newer crimes. But cold doesn't mean forgotten. Throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, detectives would periodically return to Esther's case. Sometimes this was triggered by a new tip from the public. Sometimes it was prompted by similarities to other crimes that had been committed in the region. And sometimes it was simply because a detective felt compelled to take another look at the evidence, hoping that fresh eyes might see something that had been missed before. During these decades, forensic science was evolving rapidly. DNA analysis, which didn't exist in 1979, became a standard tool for criminal investigations by the 1990s. Fingerprint databases became computerized and more comprehensive. New techniques for analyzing trace evidence were developed. Each of these advances offered the possibility that Esther's case might finally be solved. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department made several attempts over the years to apply new forensic techniques to the evidence from Esther's case. DNA samples that had been carefully preserved since 1979 were tested and retested as the technology improved. The results were entered into national databases, hoping for a match with known offenders or with evidence from other unsolved crimes. Each time new technology became available, investigators would pull Esther's case file and consider whether the new techniques might provide the breakthrough they needed. Sometimes these efforts yielded new information, but not enough to identify a specific suspect. Other times, the evidence was too degraded or contaminated to provide useful results. For Esther's family, these periodic updates were both hopeful and heartbreaking. Each time a detective called to say they were taking another look at the case, family members would allow themselves to hope that this might finally be the moment when they would get answers. When those efforts didn't lead to an arrest, the disappointment was crushing. The family also had to cope with the passage of time in other ways. Esther's parents aged, her siblings grew up and had families of their own, and new generations were born who never knew Esther but who grew up hearing her story. The immediate, raw grief of her death evolved into a deeper, more persistent sadness that became part of the family's identity. Community interest in the case also waxed and waned over the decades. Periodically, local media would run anniversary stories about Esther's unsolved murder. These stories would sometimes generate new tips from the public, but more often they served as reminders that justice had been delayed for far too long. During this period, other similar crimes were solved in the region, sometimes using DNA evidence or other forensic techniques. Each of these successes raised the question of whether the same methods might finally crack Esther's case. Investigators would compare the evidence from solved cases with what they had from Esther's murder, looking for connections or similarities that might point toward a suspect. The frustration felt by everyone involved in the case, the family, the investigators, the community, was compounded by the knowledge that somewhere out there, Esther's killer was living his life freely. He might have married, had children, held jobs, and been considered a respected member of his community, all while carrying the secret of what he had done to a 17-year-old girl on a dark mountain highway in 1979. By the 2020s, cold case investigations had been revolutionized by advances in DNA technology and genealogical research. What had once seemed impossible, identifying suspects from decades-old evidence, was becoming routine for agencies with the resources and expertise to apply these new techniques. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department had not forgotten about Esther Gonzalez. Her case remained in their cold case files, and detectives would periodically review it to see if new developments in forensic science might finally provide the answers that had eluded them for more than 4 decades. In 2024, 45 years after Esther's murder, investigators decided to take another comprehensive look at the physical evidence from her case. DNA technology had advanced significantly since the last time the evidence had been tested, and new techniques for extracting genetic material from degraded samples offered hope that they might finally get a usable DNA profile from the killer. The process of re-examining decades-old evidence is painstaking and methodical. Crime scene technicians and forensic scientists have to work with materials that may have been stored for decades, often in less than ideal conditions, and try to extract genetic information using techniques that didn't exist when the evidence was first collected. In Esther's case, the investigators were fortunate that the original detectives in 1979 had been thorough in their evidence collection and careful in their preservation methods. Even though they couldn't have imagined the DNA technology that would be available 45 years later, they had the foresight to collect and store biological evidence in ways that would later prove crucial. The new DNA analysis yielded results that earlier testing had not been able to achieve. For the first time since 1979, investigators had a genetic profile of Esther's killer. This was a major breakthrough, but it was only the first step in a process that would ultimately lead to identifying the perpetrator. The DNA profile was entered into national databases, including the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, used by law enforcement agencies across the country. This database contains DNA profiles from convicted felons, arrestees, and evidence from unsolved crimes, and it has been responsible for solving thousands of cases over the past 2 decades. Initially, the search didn't yield a direct match. Esther's killer either had never been arrested for a crime that required DNA sampling, or his DNA had not been entered into the database for other reasons. This was disappointing but not unexpected. Many cold cases require additional steps beyond simple database searches. The next phase of the investigation involved forensic genealogy, a relatively new technique that uses DNA evidence to build family trees and identify potential suspects through their relatives. This process involves uploading the DNA profile to public genealogy databases and using sophisticated analysis to identify people who share genetic markers with the unknown suspect. Forensic genealogy has been responsible for solving some of the most famous cold cases of recent years, including the Golden State Killer case in California. The technique requires specialized expertise and considerable time and resources, but it has proven remarkably effective at identifying suspects in cases where traditional methods have failed. In Esther's case, the forensic genealogy analysis began to yield promising results. Investigators were able to identify several family lines that shared genetic characteristics with the DNA from the crime scene. This narrowed the field of potential suspects significantly, but it still required traditional detective work to identify specific individuals who might have been responsible for Esther's murder. The process of building family trees and tracking down potential suspects took months of careful work. Investigators had to verify relationships, track down living relatives, and eliminate people who couldn't have been involved in the crime due to age, location, or other factors. Eventually, this painstaking process led investigators to focus on one particular individual, Louis Randy Williamson. Williamson fit the profile in several important ways. He was the right age to have committed the crime in 1979, he had lived in the area at the time, and he was genetically connected to the DNA evidence from Esther's murder scene. Louis Randy Williamson was not a name that had appeared in the original investigation into Esther Gonzalez's murder. In 1979, he had not been identified as a suspect, had not been interviewed by detectives, and had not been connected to the crime in any way that investigators could determine. This is not uncommon in cold cases. Sometimes the perpetrator manages to avoid detection entirely during the initial investigation. What investigators learned about Williamson in 2024 painted a picture of a man who had a history of violence against women. This pattern of behavior, which might not have been fully apparent in 1979, became much clearer when examined through the lens of decades of criminal records and police reports. Williamson had a criminal history that included charges related to sexual assault and violence. While he may not have been on law enforcement's radar specifically for Esther's murder, he was the type of individual who forensic psychologists know are likely to commit multiple violent crimes throughout their lives. One of the challenges investigators faced was that Williamson had died years earlier, which meant they couldn't arrest him, interview him, or prosecute him for Esther's murder. This is a common frustration in cold cases. Sometimes the breakthrough comes too late for traditional justice through the courts. However, the identification of Williamson as Esther's killer was still enormously significant for several reasons. First, it provided the answers that Esther's family had been seeking for 45 years. They finally knew who had killed their daughter and sister, and they could begin to process that information as part of their long journey toward healing. Second, it demonstrated the power of persistence and advancing technology in solving cold cases. The investigation that began in 1979 with fingerprints and blood typing had finally been resolved using genetic genealogy techniques that wouldn't be invented for another 2 decades. Third, it provided closure for the investigators who had worked on the case over the years. Many of the original detectives had retired or died during the 45 years since Esther's murder, but their careful evidence collection and preservation had ultimately made it possible to identify her killer. The process of confirming Williamson as the perpetrator involved additional DNA testing and verification. Investigators wanted to be absolutely certain of their conclusion before announcing it to the family and the public. This additional testing confirmed that the genetic evidence linked Williamson to Esther's murder with a degree of certainty that would have been sufficient for prosecution if he had still been alive. Investigators also worked to build a more complete picture of Williamson's life and activities around the time of Esther's murder. They examined his residence, employment, and social connections in 1979 to understand how he might have encountered Esther and what circumstances led to her death. This investigation revealed that Williamson had been living in the area at the time of the murder and would have been familiar with the remote stretch of Highway 243 where Esther's body was found. The location of the crime scene, which had always suggested that the killer knew the area well, was consistent with Williamson's background and residence. The revelation that Esther's killer had been identified after 45 years was met with a mixture of relief, satisfaction, and sadness by everyone involved in the case. Relief that the mystery had finally been solved, satisfaction that justice had been served even if only in the form of identification rather than prosecution, and sadness that it had taken so long and that Williamson had died without being held accountable for his crime. One of the most important and delicate aspects of solving any cold case is informing the victim's family about the breakthrough. For the Gonzalez family, who had waited 45 years for answers about Esther's murder, the news that her killer had finally been identified was both the answer to their prayers and the reopening of old wounds. The task of informing the family fell to cold case detectives who understood the enormous significance of this moment. These investigators knew that they weren't just delivering information, they were providing closure that the family had been seeking for nearly half a century. The meeting with Esther's family was emotionally charged and deeply meaningful. Family members who had grown up, gotten married, had children of their own, and lived entire adult lives while wondering who had killed Esther finally had an answer to the question that had haunted them for decades. For Esther's parents, if they were still alive, this news represented the culmination of a lifetime of hoping and waiting. For her siblings, it meant that they could finally put to rest the uncertainty that had been part of their family's story for as long as they could remember. For the younger generation of family members who had grown up hearing Esther's story, it provided a sense of completion to a family tragedy that had shaped their understanding of loss and justice. The family's reaction to learning about Louis Randy Williamson was complex. There was relief at finally having answers, but also anger that he had lived his life freely for decades while they had suffered with uncertainty. There was satisfaction that technology had finally caught up with the crime, but also sadness that Williamson had died before he could be prosecuted and forced to account for what he had done. The news also brought up practical questions that the family had to consider. Should they speak to the media about the breakthrough? How should they honor Esther's memory now that her case was solved? What did closure mean for a family that had organized their emotional lives around an unsolved tragedy? Different family members processed the news in different ways. Some felt an immediate sense of relief and closure. Others found that having answers raised new questions about the specific details of what had happened to Esther. Some wanted to learn everything possible about Williamson and his life, while others preferred to focus on Esther's memory rather than her killer. The detectives who delivered this news also had to provide the family with detailed information about how the case had been solved, what evidence had led to Williamson's identification, and why they were confident in their conclusion. This technical information was important for helping family members understand and trust the resolution of the case. The conversation with the family also included discussions about what would happen next. Since Williamson was dead, there would be no trial, no opportunity for the family to confront him in court, and no formal legal resolution to the case. The identification of the killer was the end of the story from a law enforcement perspective, but the family still had to decide how they wanted to process and respond to this information. Some family members expressed a desire to learn more about Williamson's other crimes and whether he might have been responsible for other unsolved cases. This is a natural response. When someone has caused such profound harm to your family, there's often a desire to understand the full scope of their criminal behavior. The meeting with the family was also an opportunity for investigators to thank them for their patience and cooperation over the decades. The family's willingness to stay engaged with the investigation, to provide information when requested, and to support law enforcement's efforts had been crucial to eventually solving the case. As we reach the end of Esther Gonzalez's story, we're reminded that justice can take many forms and can arrive on many different timelines. While Louis Randy Williamson was never prosecuted for Esther's murder, his identification as her killer after 45 years represents a form of justice that would have been impossible just a few decades ago. Esther was just 17 years old when her life was cut short on that February night in 1979. She never got to graduate from high school, go to college, start a career, get married, or have children. She never got to experience the full life that should have been ahead of her. Her murder robbed not just Esther of her future, but her family of a lifetime of memories they should have been able to create together. For 45 years, the Gonzalez family lived with the knowledge that someone had killed their daughter and sister and had never been held accountable. They endured decades of uncertainty, of wondering if the case would ever be solved, of hoping that each new development in forensic science might finally provide the answers they desperately needed. The resolution of Esther's case in 2024 demonstrates the incredible advances that have been made in forensic science and criminal investigation. Techniques that didn't exist in 1979, DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, computerized databases, finally provided the tools necessary to identify Louis Randy Williamson as Esther's killer. But this case also reminds us of the importance of thorough police work and careful evidence preservation. The detectives who worked Esther's case in 1979 couldn't have imagined the technology that would eventually solve it, but their meticulous collection and storage of evidence made that resolution possible decades later. The story of Esther Gonzalez and Louis Randy Williamson also highlights the reality that violent criminals often have patterns of behavior that span many years and multiple victims. Williamson's history of violence against women suggests that Esther may not have been his only victim, and her case's resolution might provide leads for other unsolved crimes. For the investigators who worked on this case over the decades, the identification of Williamson represents the successful conclusion of one of the most challenging types of police work. Cold case investigations require patience, persistence, and the willingness to repeatedly revisit old evidence with new eyes and new techniques. Most importantly, this case represents vindication for Esther Gonzalez herself. For 45 years, her killer lived with the secret of what he had done, while she lay in her grave with her story incomplete. The identification of Louis Randy Williamson as her murderer doesn't bring Esther back, but it does ensure that her story has an ending, that her death has been acknowledged and explained, and that her memory has been honored through the persistent pursuit of truth. The resolution of cold cases like Esther's provides hope for other families who are still waiting for answers about their loved ones. It demonstrates that cases are never truly closed, that advances in technology continue to provide new opportunities for justice, and that the dedication of law enforcement professionals can eventually overcome even the most challenging obstacles. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Esther Gonzalez, not just as a victim of violence, but as a young woman whose story reminds us of the value of persistence, the power of science, and the importance of never giving up on justice. Her case was solved not because investigators got lucky, but because people refused to forget her and refused to stop looking for answers. Justice for Esther was delayed by 45 years, but it was not denied. And sometimes, that has to be enough. Story 3. Tonight we're diving into a case that's still unfolding in the heart of Phoenix, Arizona. It's March 10, 2024, a Sunday afternoon that would forever change a family and leave a community searching for answers. The story I'm about to tell you involves 35-year-old Milton Ayres, a man whose life was cut tragically short on what should have been an ordinary afternoon in South Phoenix. This case remains unsolved, and tonight, we'll walk through every detail we know, hoping that somewhere in the darkness, someone listening might hold the key to bringing justice to Milton's family. To understand what happened to Milton Ayres, we need to first understand the place where his story ends. The intersection of 19th Avenue and Southern Avenue in Phoenix sits in what locals call the Lavine area, a part of South Phoenix that's seen both struggle and resilience over the decades. This isn't the Phoenix of resort hotels and golf courses that tourists see. This is working-class Phoenix, where families live in modest homes with desert landscaping, where corner stores dot the landscape, and where the sound of traffic from the nearby Interstate 17 provides a constant urban soundtrack. 19th Avenue runs north-south like a concrete river through the city, carrying thousands of commuters daily between downtown Phoenix and the sprawling suburbs to the south. Southern Avenue cuts east-west, a busy arterial road lined with small businesses, fast food restaurants, and auto repair shops. The intersection where these two roads meet isn't particularly remarkable. There's no major shopping center or landmark that draws attention. It's just another crossroads in a city full of them. But on March 10, 2024, this unremarkable intersection became the scene of a violent crime that would leave investigators scratching their heads and a family devastated. The area around 19th Avenue and Southern has its challenges. Like many urban intersections in Phoenix, it's seen its share of crime over the years. Drug activity, property crimes, and occasional violence aren't uncommon here. But broad daylight shootings? Those still shock the community, still make people lock their doors a little tighter and look over their shoulders a little more often. The weather that day was typical for March in Phoenix, warm but not yet brutally hot, with clear skies and the kind of sunshine that draws people outdoors. It was the kind of day when life happens outside, when people run errands, meet friends, go about their daily business without thinking twice about their safety. Milton Ayres was one of those people going about his business that afternoon. At 35, he was in the prime of his life, with dreams, plans, and people who loved him. He had no way of knowing that his routine Sunday afternoon would be his last. Milton Ayres was more than just a statistic, more than just another name in a police report. He was a son, a friend, a member of a community that would mourn his loss and demand answers about his death. At 35 years old, Milton had lived through the kind of ups and downs that shape a person's character. He'd grown up in Phoenix, watching the city transform from a mid-sized desert town into one of America's largest metropolitan areas. He'd seen neighborhoods change, watched new development spring up in what used to be empty desert, witnessed the way a city grows and evolves around the people who call it home. Those who knew Milton describe him as someone who was trying to make his way in the world, navigating the challenges that face many young men in urban America. He wasn't perfect, few of us are, but he was working to build something better for himself and his future. Milton had family who cared about him, friends who valued his friendship, and a place in a community that extended far beyond the intersection where his life would end. He was part of the complex web of relationships that make up any neighborhood, the casual acquaintances, the longtime friends, the family bonds that stretch across generations. On that Sunday in March, Milton was doing what millions of people do every weekend, handling the small tasks and errands that keep life moving forward. Maybe he was meeting someone, maybe running an errand, maybe just passing through the area on his way to somewhere else. The exact details of what brought him to 19th Avenue and Southern Avenue that afternoon remain unclear, another piece of the puzzle that investigators are still trying to solve. What we do know is that Milton's presence at that intersection wasn't random. He had a reason for being there, a purpose that made sense to him in the moment. It might have been as simple as stopping for gas or grabbing something to eat. It might have been meeting someone he knew. Or it might have been something more complex, a situation that we're still trying to understand. The tragedy of Milton's story isn't just in how it ended, but in all the possibilities that were cut short. At 35, he still had decades of life ahead of him. Time to grow, to change, to make amends for past mistakes and build toward future dreams. Time to be a better son, a better friend, a better member of his community. But someone made a decision that afternoon that stole all of that time away. Someone chose violence over whatever other options existed. Someone decided that Milton Ayres' life was disposable, and in doing so, they didn't just end one man's story, they created ripples of pain and loss that continue to spread through his family and community. Sunday, March 10, 2024, dawned like any other day in Phoenix. The sun rose over the Sonoran Desert, casting long shadows between the saguaro cacti and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that locals take for granted but that never fail to take visitors' breath away. For most people in the city, it was a day of rest, sleeping in a little later, having a leisurely breakfast, maybe catching up on household chores or spending time with family. The temperature was pleasant, hovering in the mid-70s, perfect weather for being outside without the oppressive heat that would come with the approaching summer months. Traffic patterns on Sundays are different in Phoenix. The weekday rush of commuters heading to downtown offices and industrial areas gives way to a more relaxed flow of people heading to church, family gatherings, shopping centers, and recreational activities. The city's rhythm slows down just a bit, becoming more humane, more livable. But for Milton Ayres, this Sunday would be anything but restful. As the afternoon progressed and the clock moved toward 4 p.m., Milton found himself in the area around 19th Avenue and Southern Avenue. The exact sequence of events that brought him there remains one of the key mysteries investigators are still trying to solve. Did he drive there himself? Was he a passenger in someone else's vehicle? Was he meeting someone, or was his presence there purely coincidental? The intersection during daylight hours on a Sunday would have been moderately busy but not chaotic. Some traffic moving in all directions, pedestrians crossing at the lights, the usual urban ballet of people and vehicles navigating shared space. There would have been witnesses around, other drivers, people walking, maybe employees or customers at nearby businesses. At approximately 4:15 p.m., the normal rhythm of the intersection was shattered by the sound of gunshots. The exact number of shots fired hasn't been publicly disclosed by investigators, but witnesses reported hearing multiple gunshots in quick succession. The sharp crack of gunfire is unmistakable, a sound that instantly transforms an ordinary moment into something terrifying and surreal. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, chaos would have ensued. People diving for cover, others running away from the sound, some pulling out their phones to call 911. Drivers stopping their cars or speeding away, depending on their proximity to the violence and their assessment of their own safety. Emergency calls flooded into the Phoenix Police Department's dispatch center. Multiple callers reported shots fired at 19th Avenue and Southern, with at least one victim down. The reports were consistent enough and urgent enough to trigger an immediate response from both police and medical personnel. Within minutes, the intersection that had been just another crossroads in the city became a crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape and swarming with first responders. The ordinary Sunday afternoon had become something else entirely, a puzzle that investigators would need to solve, a tragedy that would ripple through families and communities, and a stark reminder of how quickly violence can intrude into everyday life. The first Phoenix police officers arrived at the intersection of 19th Avenue and Southern Avenue within minutes of the initial 911 calls. In a city the size of Phoenix, response times can vary dramatically depending on the location and the availability of units, but this shooting occurred in an area with regular patrol coverage, and the urgency of the calls, shots fired with a man down, brought immediate priority response. What the officers found when they arrived was a scene of controlled chaos. Milton Ayres lay on the pavement, critically wounded from at least one gunshot. The exact location where he fell, whether on the sidewalk, in a parking lot, or in the street itself, speaks to the circumstances of the shooting, details that investigators have kept close to their chest as they work to build their case. Paramedics from the Phoenix Fire Department arrived simultaneously with the police, their training kicking in as they worked to stabilize Milton and prepare him for transport to the nearest trauma center. In Phoenix, that would likely be either Maricopa Medical Center or one of the other major hospitals equipped to handle critical gunshot wounds. The golden hour, that crucial first 60 minutes after a traumatic injury, can make the difference between life and death for shooting victims. Every second counts when someone is bleeding from gunshot wounds, and the paramedics would have worked with practiced efficiency to get Milton the help he needed as quickly as possible. While medical personnel fought to save Milton's life, police officers began the careful work of securing and processing the crime scene. This involves several critical steps that must be completed quickly while evidence is still fresh, but also methodically to ensure that nothing important is missed or contaminated. First, they would have established a perimeter around the shooting scene, using yellow crime scene tape to keep curious onlookers and non-essential personnel away from potential evidence. The size of this perimeter would depend on the specifics of what happened. If shots were fired from a vehicle, for example, the scene might extend across multiple lanes of traffic and onto adjacent sidewalks or parking areas. Next, they would have begun identifying and separating witnesses. In a busy intersection during daylight hours, there would likely have been multiple people who saw or heard something relevant to the investigation. Getting accurate witness statements requires interviewing people individually, away from each other, to prevent their accounts from being influenced by what others might say. The process of canvassing for witnesses goes beyond just the people who happened to be at the scene when police arrived. Investigators would have gone door to door at nearby businesses and residences, looking for anyone who might have seen something unusual in the minutes or hours leading up to the shooting. They would have checked for security cameras at gas stations, convenience stores, and other businesses that might have captured the incident or the moments before and after. Physical evidence collection would have begun immediately as well. Shell casings, if any were left behind, would be photographed in place and then carefully collected and bagged. Any blood evidence would be documented and sampled. If the shooting involved a vehicle, investigators would look for tire marks, broken glass, or other physical traces of what occurred. The intersection would have remained closed to traffic for hours while this painstaking work continued. In a city like Phoenix, closing a major intersection creates ripple effects throughout the transportation network, but preserving the integrity of a crime scene takes precedence over traffic convenience. Unfortunately, despite the quick response of emergency medical personnel and their best efforts, Milton Ayre's injuries proved to be fatal. The exact timeline of when he died, whether at the scene, during transport, or at the hospital, hasn't been publicly disclosed, but the end result was the same. A 35-year-old man's life had been cut short by violence, and his death had created a homicide investigation that continues to this day. In the hours and days following Milton Ayre's death, the Phoenix Police Department's homicide unit took over the investigation. Homicide investigations in a major city like Phoenix follow established protocols developed over decades of experience, but each case also presents its own unique challenges and opportunities. The lead investigators assigned to Milton's case would have begun by reviewing all the physical evidence collected at the scene, all the witness statements taken in the immediate aftermath, and all the available surveillance footage from the area. This process of information gathering and analysis forms the foundation of any successful homicide investigation. One of the first challenges investigators faced was developing a clear timeline of events. What time did Milton arrive at the intersection? Was he alone or with others? What was he doing in the minutes before the shooting? Who else was in the area at the relevant time? These basic questions, which might seem simple, can actually be quite complex to answer definitively. Witness statements, while crucial, can also be problematic. People who witness violent crimes are often traumatized by what they've seen, and trauma can affect memory in unpredictable ways. Some witnesses might have crystal clear recall of certain details while being completely unable to remember others. Some might conflate details from different moments in time. Others might be influenced by what they think they should have seen versus what they actually observed. This is why investigators work to corroborate witness accounts with physical evidence and documentation whenever possible. Security camera footage, cell phone records, credit card transactions, and other digital evidence can provide objective timestamps and locations that help build a reliable timeline of events. the question of motive became central to the investigation early on. Was this a random shooting, a case of Milton being in the wrong place at the wrong time when violence erupted between other parties? Was it targeted, with Milton specifically chosen as a victim for reasons related to his personal life, his past, or his relationships? Or was it something in between, perhaps a robbery gone wrong, or a confrontation that escalated beyond what anyone intended? Each of these possibilities would point the investigation in different directions. A random shooting might focus on identifying suspects with a pattern of similar crimes or who were known to be in the area at the relevant time. A targeted shooting would require investigators to dig deep into Milton's personal life, his relationships, his financial situation, and his recent activities to identify who might have wanted to harm him and why. The investigators also had to consider the possibility that Milton's death was connected to other crimes in the area. Phoenix, like most major cities, sees patterns in criminal activity, the same perpetrators committing multiple similar crimes, or criminal networks operating in specific geographic areas. Could Milton's shooting be related to other recent violent crimes in South Phoenix? Were there similar unsolved cases that might provide leads? Another crucial aspect of the investigation involved tracing Milton's movements in the days and hours before his death. Where had he been? Who had he spoken with? Had he received any threats or expressed any concerns about his safety? This type of background investigation often reveals important context that can help explain why someone became a victim of violence. As the investigation into Milton Ayre's death progressed, Phoenix police developed what information they could about potential suspects. What they released to the public was limited but significant. They were looking for a Hispanic male in connection with the shooting. This description, while general, represents what investigators felt confident releasing based on witness accounts and other evidence. The decision of how much suspect information to release publicly is always a delicate balance for police departments. Release too little, and you might miss opportunities for the public to provide helpful tips. Release too much, and you might compromise the investigation or lead to false accusations against innocent people. The description of a Hispanic male suspect in Phoenix narrows the field somewhat, but not dramatically. Phoenix's population is approximately 42% Hispanic or Latino, meaning hundreds of thousands of people could theoretically fit this basic description. Investigators would need much more specific information to identify and apprehend a suspect. This is where the painstaking work of detective investigation becomes crucial. Beyond the basic physical description, investigators would have been working to develop additional details about the suspect. What was his approximate age and height? What was he wearing? Did he have any distinctive features, tattoos, or other identifying characteristics? Was he on foot or in a vehicle? If in a vehicle, what make, model, and color? They would also have been working to understand the suspect's connection to the victim and the crime scene. Did Milton know his attacker? Was this someone from his neighborhood, his workplace, his social circle? Or was the suspect a stranger, someone who crossed paths with Milton for reasons that investigators hadn't yet discovered? The investigation would have expanded to include known criminals in the area who fit the general description and who had histories of violence. Phoenix police maintain extensive databases of criminal records, arrest photos, and known associates that can be invaluable in cases like this. Investigators might have shown photo lineups to witnesses, hoping for a positive identification that could provide a breakthrough in the case. They would also have been following up on any physical evidence that might point to a specific individual. If shell casings were recovered at the scene, they could be tested for fingerprints or compared to weapons used in other crimes. If DNA evidence was available, it could be run through national databases looking for matches. The canvassing of the neighborhood would have continued as well, with investigators returning to speak with residents and business owners who might not have been available during the initial response. Sometimes witnesses come forward days or weeks after a crime, either because they weren't initially present or because it took time for them to process what they had seen and decide to contact police. Social media and digital investigations would have played an increasingly important role as well. Investigators would have examined Milton's social media accounts, looking for any threats, disputes, or concerning interactions in the weeks and months before his death. They would have also searched for any posts or messages from potential suspects that might provide clues about their identity or whereabouts. Despite all of these investigative efforts, the case remained unsolved as weeks turned into months. The trail was growing cold, but investigators weren't giving up. Cold cases can sometimes be solved years later when new evidence emerges, when witnesses decide to come forward, or when advances in forensic technology provide new ways to analyze old evidence. The murder of Milton Ayres didn't occur in a vacuum. It happened in a community where people live, work, raise families, and try to build better lives for themselves and their children. The impact of his death rippled far beyond the immediate crime scene, affecting neighbors, local business owners, and community members who had never met Milton but who understood that his death represented a threat to everyone's safety and peace of mind. In the days following the shooting, residents of the area around 19th Avenue and Southern Avenue found themselves looking over their shoulders more often, locking their doors a little tighter, and having conversations with their children about staying safe in a neighborhood that suddenly felt less secure. Local business owners, particularly those near the intersection where the shooting occurred, had to grapple with the reality that their customers might avoid the area out of fear, potentially impacting their livelihoods. Some invested in additional security measures, better lighting, security cameras, alarm systems, trying to create safe spaces for their employees and customers. The shooting also sparked broader conversations about violence in South Phoenix, a part of the city that has struggled with higher crime rates than some other areas. Community leaders and residents began organizing meetings to discuss safety concerns and to pressure city officials for increased police presence and community resources. These conversations often reveal the complex challenges facing urban communities. Residents want to feel safe, but they also want to maintain the character and accessibility of their neighborhoods. They want effective policing, but they also want community-based solutions that address the root causes of violence rather than just responding to its symptoms. For Milton's family, the community response provided both comfort and additional pain. It was reassuring to know that their loved one's death mattered to people beyond their immediate circle, that neighbors and strangers were demanding justice and working to prevent similar tragedies. But it was also a constant reminder of their loss, a public dimension to their private grief that could be both supportive and overwhelming. The family would have been dealing with the immediate practical challenges that follow any sudden death, funeral arrangements, financial concerns, legal questions, while also coping with the additional trauma of knowing that their loved one died violently and that his killer remained at large. They would have been working with victim advocates from the police department and potentially from community organizations, people trained to help families navigate the complex systems involved in homicide investigations. These advocates provide crucial support, explaining legal procedures, connecting families with resources, and serving as liaisons between families and investigators. The unsolved nature of Milton's case added another layer of difficulty for his family. Without arrests or closure, they were left in a state of suspended animation, unable to fully process their grief because the story felt incomplete. This is one of the cruelest aspects of unsolved murders. They deny families the sense of resolution that can be an important part of healing. Community members who wanted to help but didn't know how might have organized fundraisers for the family, vigils to honor Milton's memory, or community meetings to discuss crime prevention. These gestures, while well-intentioned, can sometimes feel both helpful and insufficient to families dealing with the magnitude of their loss. Months after Milton Ayres' death, the investigation continues. Homicide cases don't simply get filed away when they're not solved quickly, they remain active investigations, with detectives continuing to follow up on new leads, re-interview witnesses, and explore new avenues of inquiry. Modern police departments have learned that some cases require patience and persistence. DNA evidence might need to be retested using newer technology. Witnesses who were initially reluctant to come forward might change their minds months or years later. Suspects might be arrested for other crimes and decide to cooperate with investigators in exchange for consideration on their charges. The Phoenix Police Department has made appeals to the public for information about Milton's case, recognizing that someone in the community likely knows something that could help solve the murder. These appeals are carefully crafted to encourage people to come forward while also protecting the integrity of the investigation. Anonymous tip lines allow people to provide information without fear of retaliation or involvement in legal proceedings. These tips might seem insignificant to the person providing them, but they can sometimes provide the missing piece that investigators need to make an arrest. Cold case units in major police departments specialize in revisiting unsolved murders with fresh eyes and new techniques. They might identify investigative approaches that weren't tried initially, or they might benefit from advances in forensic science that weren't available when the crime first occurred. The investigation into Milton's death also benefits from regional cooperation between law enforcement agencies. If the suspect has committed crimes in other jurisdictions, information sharing between police departments can help identify patterns and leads that might not be apparent when looking at just one case in isolation. Technology continues to evolve in ways that help solve crimes. Cell phone data, social media analysis, and facial recognition software provide investigative tools that didn't exist just a few years ago. License plate readers and traffic cameras create digital trails that can help investigators track suspects' movements before and after crimes. But technology is only as useful as the human investigators who know how to use it effectively. The detectives working on Milton's case bring decades of combined experience in solving homicides, understanding human behavior, and navigating the complex legal and procedural requirements involved in building cases that can succeed in court. They also understand that solving the case isn't just about arrests and convictions, it's about providing answers to Milton's family and closure to a community that has been impacted by his death. This human element of police work is often overlooked, but it's what motivates many investigators to continue working on difficult cases long after the initial burst of activity has faded. The hope is that someone listening to this story tonight, someone who has information about what happened to Milton Ayers on that Sunday afternoon in Phoenix, will find the courage to come forward. Justice delayed is not justice denied, and it's never too late to do the right thing. As we reach the end of Milton Ayers' story, at least, the part of it that we know so far, we're reminded of how fragile life can be and how violence can intrude into the most ordinary moments without warning or explanation. Milton was 35 years old when he died, with decades of life still ahead of him. He had people who cared about him, dreams that will now never be fulfilled, and contributions to make to his community that will never happen. His death represents not just the loss of one man, but the loss of all the possibilities that died with him. For his family, the pain of losing Milton is compounded by the frustration of not knowing who killed him or why. They live with questions that may never be answered, unless someone with information decides to come forward and help bring this case to a resolution. For the community around 19th Avenue and Southern Avenue in Phoenix, Milton's death serves as a reminder that violence can touch anyone, anywhere, at any time. It's also a call to action, a recognition that creating safe communities requires the involvement of everyone who lives and works in them. The Phoenix Police Department continues to investigate Milton's murder, following leads and hoping for the breakthrough that will identify his killer. If you have any information about this case, no matter how insignificant it might seem, please contact the Phoenix Police Department or submit an anonymous tip through Silent Witness. Milton Ayers deserves justice. His family deserves answers. And his community deserves to know that violence will not go unpunished, that every life has value, and that no one will be forgotten. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Milton Ayers. Remember that he was more than just a victim, he was a person with a story, with people who loved him, with a place in the world that is now empty. And remember that somewhere out there, someone knows what happened on that Sunday afternoon in March. Someone holds the key to bringing Milton's story to its proper conclusion. Justice may be delayed, but it should never be denied. And sometimes, it just takes one person willing to do the right thing to make all the difference. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 4. In the age of social media, we've all become curators of our own lives, carefully selecting which moments to share and which to keep private. We post our happiest photos, our most successful achievements, our most beautiful moments. But sometimes, the perfect life we see online masks a darker reality, one that can only be uncovered by following the digital breadcrumbs that modern technology leaves behind. This story takes us to Portland, Oregon, in the autumn of 2022, where the investigation into a missing person case would ultimately reveal how our digital footprints can both conceal the truth and, eventually, expose it entirely. This is the story of Rebecca Martinez, a 28-year-old marketing professional whose carefully curated Instagram account told one story, while her digital data told quite another. It's a story about deception, obsession, and how modern technology both enabled a crime and ultimately solved it. Most importantly, it's a story with resolution, a case where justice prevailed and the truth emerged from the shadows of our interconnected world. Rebecca Martinez had 47,000 Instagram followers, and to them, her life looked absolutely perfect. Her feed was a carefully orchestrated display of artisanal coffee cups, sunset yoga sessions, weekend hiking adventures, and cozy evenings in her beautifully decorated Portland apartment. She worked as a digital marketing specialist for a sustainable clothing company called EcoThread, a job that seemed tailor-made for her environmentally conscious, aesthetically pleasing personal brand. Rebecca had moved to Portland from Phoenix 3 years earlier, drawn by the city's reputation for creativity, sustainability, and outdoor recreation. Her apartment in the Pearl District was everything you'd expect from her social media presence: exposed brick walls, hanging plants cascading from macrame holders, vintage furniture mixed with modern touches, and always perfect lighting for photographs. But Rebecca's most prominent online presence wasn't just about lifestyle content. She had become a vocal advocate for women's safety, particularly focusing on digital stalking and online harassment. Her posts about personal security, safe dating practices, and recognizing warning signs in relationships had gained significant attention and engagement. "Trust your instincts," she would write in captions accompanying photos of her morning coffee or evening walks. "If something feels wrong, it probably is. Your safety is worth more than politeness." These posts resonated with thousands of women who shared their own stories in the comments, creating a community of support around Rebecca's account. She had even started hosting monthly workshops at local coffee shops, teaching women about digital privacy, safe social media practices, and recognizing signs of stalking behavior. The irony of what would eventually happen to Rebecca was not lost on the investigators who would later study her case. On October 15, 2022, Rebecca posted what would become her final Instagram story, a photo of her homemade butternut squash soup with the caption, "Perfect Sunday evening vibes. Sometimes the simple things are the best things." The post showed her kitchen table with a bowl of soup, a book, and a mug of tea, all artfully arranged with her usual attention to aesthetic detail. But while Rebecca's online presence suggested a peaceful Sunday evening at home, her digital activity told a different story entirely. Her phone's location data showed her leaving her apartment at 7:23 p.m., driving to a part of Portland she rarely visited, and then, nothing. Her phone went dark at 8:47 p.m., and Rebecca Martinez was never seen alive again. The contrast between Rebecca's carefully maintained online persona and her actual final hours would become central to understanding what happened to her, and who was responsible. Monica Chen had been Rebecca's closest friend since college, and she was the first person to realize something was seriously wrong. Monica lived in Seattle but maintained daily contact with Rebecca through texts, phone calls, and social media interactions. When Rebecca failed to respond to Monica's Monday morning text, something that had never happened in their 5-year friendship, Monica felt an immediate sense of unease. Rebecca was religiously punctual about communication, often responding to messages within minutes. Rebecca treated her phone like an extension of herself, Monica would later tell investigators. She was always connected, always responsive. Radio silence was completely out of character. Monica's concern deepened when she noticed that Rebecca had missed her usual Monday morning Instagram post, a motivational quote paired with a photo from her weekend activities. Rebecca posted with clockwork regularity, and her social media presence was integral to both her personal brand and her professional responsibilities. By Monday afternoon, Monica was calling Rebecca's workplace. Sarah Kim, Rebecca's supervisor at EcoThread, confirmed that Rebecca hadn't shown up for work and hadn't called in sick, another unprecedented occurrence. Rebecca was incredibly professional, Sarah told Monica. In 3 years of working here, she had never missed a day without advance notice. We were already planning to check on her if we didn't hear from her by end of business. Monica decided to take immediate action. Living 4 hours away in Seattle, she couldn't check on Rebecca personally, but she had the contact information for Rebecca's apartment building manager and her emergency contacts. The apartment building manager, David Petrosky, agreed to do a welfare check on Rebecca's unit. What he found when he used his master key to enter apartment 412 would launch one of Portland's most complex digital investigations. Rebecca's apartment looked exactly as it should, clean, organized, aesthetically pleasing. Her bed was made, her dishes were clean, and there were no signs of struggle or disturbance. The only unusual detail was that her laptop was open on her kitchen counter, still logged into her Instagram account, showing the editing interface for a post that was never published. The unpublished post contained a photo of Rebecca's reflection in her bathroom mirror, with a caption that read, "Sometimes you have to face hard truths about the people in your life. Trust your instincts, even when it's difficult." This message was completely different from Rebecca's usual content, more personal, more serious, and notably lacking her typical upbeat tone and aesthetic polish. David Petrosky immediately called the Portland Police Bureau, and by Tuesday morning, Detective Amanda Foster was standing in Rebecca's apartment, beginning what would become one of the most digitally complex missing person investigations in the department's history. Detective Foster was a 12-year veteran with specialized training in technology-related crimes. She had worked cases involving cyberstalking, online harassment, and digital evidence recovery, making her uniquely qualified to investigate Rebecca's disappearance. The first thing Detective Foster noticed was the disconnect between Rebecca's online presence and the reality of her living space. While her Instagram suggested a life of spontaneous adventures and social activities, her apartment revealed someone who was much more isolated and security-conscious than her public persona indicated. Rebecca had installed additional locks on her door, blackout curtains on all windows, and a sophisticated security system that recorded both video and audio. Her computer setup included VPN software, encrypted messaging applications, and multiple backup drives, the digital tools of someone who took privacy and security very seriously. This doesn't match the carefree lifestyle influencer image, Detective Foster noted in her initial report. Subject appears to have been significantly more concerned about personal security than her public social media presence suggested. Detective Foster's investigation quickly revealed that Rebecca Martinez's digital life was far more complex than anyone had realized. Working with the Portland Police Bureau's Digital Forensics Unit, investigators began the painstaking process of reconstructing Rebecca's online activities in the days leading up to her disappearance. Rebecca's phone records showed an unusual pattern of communication in the week before she vanished. She had received dozens of calls from unknown numbers, most of which lasted less than 10 seconds, the hallmark of someone hanging up immediately when the call was answered. Her text message history revealed something even more disturbing. Rebecca had been receiving anonymous messages for over 2 months, messages that started as seemingly innocent compliments about her Instagram posts but gradually became more personal and invasive. "You look beautiful in your morning coffee posts," read one of the earlier messages. "I love how you arrange everything so perfectly." But the messages evolved. "I noticed you use the same coffee shop on Tuesday mornings. Grind coffee on Burnside, right? And then, you shouldn't walk alone after your evening yoga classes. Portland isn't as safe as you think." Detective Foster realized they were looking at a classic pattern of escalating stalking behavior, made more sophisticated by the stalker's apparent knowledge of social media analysis and digital surveillance techniques. The forensics team discovered that Rebecca had been documenting this harassment, taking screenshots of messages and maintaining a detailed record of suspicious online activity. She had even created a private Google Drive folder labeled Safety Documentation, where she stored evidence of the stalking behavior. In this folder, investigators found a timeline Rebecca had created, tracking the escalation of contact from her stalker. The document revealed that Rebecca had identified several fake social media profiles that were likely created by the same person, all designed to monitor her online activity and gather personal information. Rebecca had also documented instances where the stalker demonstrated knowledge of her daily routines that couldn't have been gained from her public social media posts alone. The person knew which grocery store she used, what time she typically left for work, and even details about her apartment building's security procedures. Most chilling of all, Rebecca's documentation showed that the stalker had begun making subtle threats, suggesting that her advocacy for women's safety was interfering with natural relationships and that she needed to learn to mind her own business. Detective Foster realized that Rebecca's public advocacy work had likely attracted the attention of someone who viewed her safety education efforts as a personal threat. The investigation took a significant turn when digital forensics specialist officer Ryan Park discovered something unusual in Rebecca's browser history. In the days before her disappearance, Rebecca had been researching legal options for obtaining restraining orders, and she had scheduled a consultation with a lawyer who specialized in stalking cases. But more importantly, Rebecca had been conducting her own digital investigation into her stalker's identity. Her search history showed queries for reverse phone number lookups, social media investigation techniques, and methods for tracking fake online profiles. She was essentially conducting her own parallel investigation, Officer Park told Detective Foster. Rebecca wasn't just documenting the harassment, she was actively trying to identify who was responsible. This discovery led to a breakthrough. Hidden in Rebecca's private notes, investigators found a name, possible match, C. Davidson, Phoenix connection. Rebecca had apparently discovered a potential link between her stalker and someone from her past in Phoenix, Arizona, where she had lived before moving to Portland. Detective Foster immediately contacted the Phoenix Police Department to investigate the C. Davidson connection Rebecca had identified. Working with Phoenix detective Carlos Mendez, the investigation began to uncover a disturbing pattern that stretched across multiple states. Christopher Davidson was a 34-year-old software developer who had worked for the same digital marketing agency as Rebecca during her final year in Phoenix. According to former colleagues, Davidson had been inappropriately interested in Rebecca, frequently asking personal questions and trying to extend work conversations into social situations. Rebecca had left Phoenix somewhat abruptly in 2019, citing personal reasons for her move to Portland. Her former supervisor, Janet Williams, remembered the situation clearly. Rebecca was professional about the whole thing, but I could tell something was bothering her, Janet told Detective Mendez. She mentioned feeling uncomfortable with a coworker but didn't want to make a big deal about it. When she got the job offer in Portland, she took it immediately. Detective Mendez discovered that Christopher Davidson had left his Phoenix job just 2 months after Rebecca's departure, claiming he wanted to work remotely and travel. But employment records and tax filings told a different story. Davidson had actually moved to Portland in early 2020, just 6 months after Rebecca's relocation. This was not a coincidence. Further investigation revealed that Davidson had been living in Portland under a slightly different name, Chris Davis, and had been working as a freelance web developer while maintaining extensive surveillance of Rebecca's activities. Portland police obtained a search warrant for Davidson's apartment, located just 8 blocks from Rebecca's building in the Pearl District. What they found inside was a disturbing shrine to obsession and digital stalking. Davidson's apartment contained multiple computer monitors displaying Rebecca's social media accounts, printed photographs of her taken from public posts, and maps of Portland with her frequent locations marked in red ink. He had created detailed schedules of her daily routines, documented her work schedule, and even identified her friends and professional contacts. Most disturbing of all, investigators found evidence that Davidson had been physically following Rebecca for months, using sophisticated surveillance equipment to monitor her movements without being detected. He had installed tracking software on his phone that allowed him to receive notifications whenever Rebecca posted new content online, and he had created multiple fake social media accounts to monitor her activity without her knowledge. But the most important discovery was Davidson's computer hard drive, which contained a detailed plan for what he called teaching Rebecca a lesson about interfering with private matters. The plan, written in a document titled Final Solution, outlined Davidson's intention to confront Rebecca about her women's safety advocacy, which he believed was poisoning women against men and destroying natural relationship dynamics. Davidson had planned to force Rebecca to publicly recant her safety advocacy and to admit that her advice was harmful to society. The document suggested that if Rebecca refused to comply, she would face the consequences of her actions. This digital evidence provided investigators with a clear motive and a detailed plan, but they still needed to find Rebecca, and determine whether she was still alive. Armed with Christopher Davidson's real identity and evidence of his obsessive behavior, Portland police launched a comprehensive search operation. Davidson's apartment had been abandoned, but his hasty departure had left behind crucial digital evidence that would ultimately lead to his capture and the resolution of Rebecca's case. Detective Foster worked closely with the FBI's cyber crime unit to track Davidson's digital footprint. His online activity revealed a pattern of movement that suggested he was traveling east, possibly toward the Midwest. Davidson had made a critical error in his escape planning. He had used his real credit card to purchase gas and food during his flight, creating a clear trail of his movements. Financial records showed purchases in Boise, Idaho, then Salt Lake City, Utah, and finally Denver, Colorado. But the most important digital evidence came from Davidson's phone, which he had apparently forgotten to properly dispose of. The device was still transmitting location data, and investigators were able to track his movements in real time. On October 20th, 5 days after Rebecca's disappearance, Davidson was arrested at a truck stop outside of Denver, Colorado. He was found sleeping in his car, surrounded by camping equipment and supplies that suggested he had been planning to disappear into the wilderness. When arrested, Davidson initially claimed he was simply traveling for work and knew nothing about Rebecca Martinez's disappearance. But the overwhelming digital evidence made his denials impossible to maintain. Under interrogation, Davidson's story began to change. He admitted to following Rebecca to Portland and to creating fake social media accounts to monitor her activities. He claimed his surveillance was protective rather than threatening, and that he had been concerned about her safety in Portland. But when investigators showed Davidson the evidence from his computer, including his detailed plans and his document outlining consequences for Rebecca, his facade began to crumble. Detective Foster used a technique that would prove crucial to solving the case. She showed Davidson screenshots of Rebecca's own investigation into his identity, proving that Rebecca had discovered his real name and was planning to report him to authorities. "She knew who you were, Christopher," Detective Foster said during the interrogation. "She had figured out your real name, your employment history, everything. She was going to expose you." This revelation triggered a confession that finally revealed what had happened to Rebecca Martinez. Christopher Davidson's confession, given over the course of 3 days of intensive interrogation, revealed the disturbing details of Rebecca's final hours and led investigators to the location where her body had been concealed. According to Davidson, he had been monitoring Rebecca's digital investigation into his identity and had realized that she was close to exposing him to authorities. On October 15th, he decided to confront her before she could take legal action. Davidson had used a fake emergency to lure Rebecca from her apartment, sending her a message claiming to be from her building's management company about a security incident that required her immediate attention in the parking garage. When Rebecca went to investigate, Davidson confronted her with evidence of her investigation into his identity. He demanded that she delete all documentation of his surveillance and promised to stop her women's safety advocacy work. Rebecca refused and attempted to call for help, leading to a struggle during which Davidson struck her with a tire iron he had brought for intimidation purposes. Rebecca died from her injuries in the parking garage of her own apartment building. Davidson then used his technical skills to dispose of evidence and cover his tracks. He placed Rebecca's body in his car and drove to a remote area in the Mount Hood National Forest, where he concealed it in a location he had scouted weeks earlier during his surveillance activities. He then returned to Rebecca's apartment building, used her keys to enter her apartment, and posted the Instagram story about her perfect Sunday evening to create a false timeline and suggest she had been alive later than she actually was. Davidson had planned to gradually delete Rebecca's social media accounts and online presence, making it appear that she had chosen to disappear voluntarily. But Monica Chen's quick action in reporting Rebecca missing had accelerated the investigation timeline and prevented Davidson from fully executing his cover-up plan. On October 22, following Davidson's directions, search teams located Rebecca's remains in a remote section of the Mount Hood National Forest. The recovery operation was conducted with careful attention to preserving evidence and treating Rebecca's remains with dignity. The forensic evidence recovered from the scene corroborated Davidson's confession and provided additional details about the crime. Rebecca had fought for her life, scratching Davidson and tearing his clothing during the struggle. DNA evidence under her fingernails matched Davidson's genetic profile. Most importantly, investigators found Rebecca's emergency backup phone, a device she had apparently hidden in her car as a safety precaution. The phone contained video footage of Davidson's initial approach in the parking garage, providing visual evidence of the crime. Christopher Davidson was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated stalking, and multiple technology-related crimes. The evidence against him was overwhelming: physical evidence, digital forensics, GPS tracking data, and his own detailed confession created an airtight case for prosecution. During the trial, which took place in the spring of 2023, prosecutors used Davidson's own digital evidence to demonstrate the premeditated nature of his crime. His surveillance records, fake social media accounts, and written plans showed a pattern of escalating obsession that had culminated in murder. The prosecution also highlighted Rebecca's own investigation work, showing how her careful documentation of the stalking behavior had provided crucial evidence for solving the case. In a sense, Rebecca had helped solve her own murder through her meticulous record-keeping and digital awareness. Davidson's defense team attempted to argue that the killing had been unplanned, the result of a confrontation that had escalated beyond his intentions. But the evidence of surveillance, planning, and attempted cover-up made this argument unsustainable. On June 15, 2023, Christopher Davidson was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge noted that Davidson had used his technical skills to weaponize technology against an innocent victim, and that his crimes represented a fundamental betrayal of the trust we place in our digital systems. The case had broader implications beyond individual justice. Rebecca's story became a powerful example of how digital evidence could be used both to commit crimes and to solve them. Her advocacy work on women's safety took on new meaning as investigators realized how accurately she had predicted the dangers she would eventually face. Monica Chen, working with Rebecca's family, established the Rebecca Martinez Digital Safety Foundation, an organization dedicated to educating women about online privacy, digital stalking recognition, and technology-based safety planning. The foundation's work was built on Rebecca's own research and advocacy, ensuring that her voice would continue to help protect women even after her death. The foundation developed educational materials, safety apps, and support networks for women experiencing digital harassment. EcoThread, Rebecca's former employer, created a scholarship program for women pursuing careers in digital marketing and online safety advocacy. The company also implemented new policies for employee safety and digital privacy training. Rebecca Martinez's case highlighted both the vulnerabilities and the strengths of our interconnected digital world. While technology had enabled her stalker to monitor and ultimately harm her, it also provided the evidence that brought him to justice. Detective Foster often used Rebecca's case as a teaching example in law enforcement training programs, demonstrating how modern investigations must integrate digital forensics, social media analysis, and traditional detective work. Rebecca's case showed us that victims are often their own best investigators, Detective Foster would tell trainees. She documented everything, followed digital breadcrumbs, and essentially solved her own case. Our job was to follow the trail she had already blazed. The case also demonstrated the importance of taking digital harassment seriously. Rebecca's stalker had exhibited clear warning signs and escalating behavior patterns that, if reported and investigated earlier, might have prevented the tragic outcome. Social media platforms implemented new policies for detecting and preventing stalking behavior, partly in response to cases like Rebecca's. These measures included automated detection of harassment patterns, improved reporting mechanisms, and better cooperation with law enforcement investigations. Christopher Davidson's conviction was one of the first cases in Oregon to extensively use social media evidence, GPS tracking data, and digital forensics to secure a murder conviction. The legal precedents established in the case have been used in dozens of subsequent prosecutions involving technology-enabled crimes. As our story comes to an end, it's important to remember that Rebecca Martinez's legacy extends far beyond the tragic circumstances of her death. Her advocacy work, her careful documentation of threats, and her efforts to educate other women about safety have saved lives and prevented other potential victims from experiencing similar harm. The digital age has created new opportunities for those who wish to harm others, but it has also created new tools for justice and prevention. Rebecca's story reminds us that our online lives leave traces that can both expose us to danger and protect us from it. Her case solved several important mysteries about how technology intersects with personal safety, criminal behavior, and law enforcement investigation. But most importantly, it demonstrated that individual awareness, careful documentation, and community support can make the difference between a crime that goes unsolved and justice that prevails. The Mount Hood National Forest, where Rebecca's remains were found, has become a place of remembrance for those who knew her. The Rebecca Martinez Memorial Trail, established by local hiking groups, provides a peaceful space for reflection on the importance of women's safety and the power of community support. Portland's Pearl District, where Rebecca lived and worked, has implemented new safety measures including improved lighting, security cameras, and emergency communication systems. These changes were made in direct response to lessons learned from Rebecca's case. Every October 15th, on the anniversary of Rebecca's disappearance, the Digital Safety Foundation hosts workshops and awareness events across the country. These gatherings honor Rebecca's memory while providing practical education about online safety, digital privacy, and recognizing warning signs of stalking behavior. Christopher Davidson remains in prison, where he will spend the rest of his life. His case has been studied by criminologists, digital security experts, and law enforcement professionals as an example of how technology can both enable and solve crimes. But the most important legacy of Rebecca's story is the ongoing work to protect others from similar harm. Every woman who learns to recognize digital stalking behaviors, every person who takes online threats seriously, and every law enforcement officer who understands the importance of digital evidence, all carry forward the lessons that Rebecca's advocacy and investigation taught us. As you settle into sleep tonight, remember Rebecca Martinez not as a victim, but as a teacher whose careful work and dedication to helping others ultimately led to justice and prevention. Her digital trail became a beacon that guided investigators to the truth and helped ensure that her attacker could never harm anyone else. The gentle sounds of the Pacific Northwest, rain on windows, wind through evergreen trees, the distant hum of city life, continue to provide the backdrop for a community that has learned to be both more aware of digital dangers and more confident in the power of technology to protect and serve justice. Story 5. This story takes place in Burlington, Vermont, a college town known for its vibrant art scene, local breweries, and stunning lake views. It's the kind of place where people feel safe walking alone at night, where neighbors know each other's names, and where the most exciting crime stories usually involve stolen bicycles or underage drinking violations. But every community, no matter how peaceful, has its shadows. And sometimes, those shadows hide secrets that change everything. Let me take you back to that Thursday evening in September. The air was crisp with the first hint of autumn, and the leaves were just beginning to show touches of gold and crimson. At Cedar Point Marina, just south of Burlington's downtown waterfront, the day was winding down in the most ordinary way imaginable. Marina manager Robert Kellerman was doing his usual evening rounds, checking that boats were properly secured and that the fuel pumps were turned off for the night. At 67 years old, Robert had been managing marinas for over 30 years. He knew every inch of Cedar Point, every creaky dock board, every loose railing, every hidden corner where teenagers sometimes gathered to drink cheap beer and watch the sunset. The marina housed about 200 boats during peak season, ranging from small sailing dinghies to impressive cabin cruisers worth more than most people's homes. September was typically a quieter time, with many boat owners already hauling their vessels out for winter storage. But there were still enough regular visitors to keep Robert busy. That evening, as Robert made his rounds, he noticed a few familiar faces. There was Dr. Patricia Huang, a pediatrician from Burlington who owned a 32-foot sailboat called Second Wind. She was working on her boat's rigging, preparing for what she told Robert would likely be her last sail of the season. Dr. Huang was meticulous about maintenance, often spending entire evenings just cleaning and organizing her vessel. At the far end of D-Dock, college student Jake Morrison was washing down his small motorboat, well, technically his father's boat, but Jake had been using it all summer for weekend trips and fishing expeditions. Jake was a senior at the University of Vermont, studying environmental science, and he'd told Robert he was planning to take the boat out early Friday morning to collect water samples for his thesis project. The evening progressed peacefully. Dr. Huang finished her work and left around 8:30, waving goodbye to Robert as she walked to her silver Subaru Outback in the parking lot. Jake continued working on his boat, occasionally chatting with Robert when their paths crossed. Robert appreciated Jake's enthusiasm for the water and his respectful attitude, so different from some of the entitled college kids who sometimes caused problems at the marina. Around 9:15, Robert was locking up the marina office when he noticed a dark sedan pull into the parking lot. It wasn't unusual for people to visit the marina in the evening. Sometimes boat owners forgot something and came back to retrieve it, or couples would park by the water to watch the lights of Burlington twinkling across the lake. The sedan parked near the entrance to the main dock, but Robert couldn't see the occupants clearly in the dim light. He made a mental note of it, part of his security routine, but didn't think much of it at the time. People had every right to visit the public portions of the marina, and the car wasn't blocking any access points. Robert finished his duties and headed home to his small apartment overlooking the lake, looking forward to a quiet evening with his cat and a good book. As he drove away, he glanced back at the marina and saw Jake still working on his boat, the young man's headlamp creating a small circle of light in the growing darkness. It was the kind of peaceful evening that Robert had come to love about his job. The water was calm, the air was clean, and everything felt right with the world. He had no way of knowing that by morning, that sense of peace would be shattered forever. Friday morning arrived with a thick fog rolling off Lake Champlain, the kind of dense, gray mist that makes the familiar world feel mysterious and dreamlike. Robert arrived at the marina at his usual time, 6:30 a.m., carrying a thermos of coffee and looking forward to a quiet morning of paperwork before the day's activities began. But as Robert walked toward his office, something immediately felt wrong. Jake Morrison's boat, a 19-foot Boston whaler called Study Break, was gone from its slip at the end of D-Dock. The heavy morning fog made it difficult to see far across the water, but Robert couldn't make out the boat anywhere within his line of sight. At first, Robert assumed Jake had left early for his thesis research, just as he'd mentioned the evening before. College students often kept unusual hours, and Jake had seemed particularly eager to collect his water samples. Robert made himself a note to check with Jake later about proper notification procedures. Marina rules required advance notice for early departures, both for security and safety reasons. But as Robert continued his morning routine, small details began to trouble him. Jake's car, a beat-up Honda Civic with university parking stickers, was still in the marina parking lot. Why would Jake take the boat out without his car? How was he planning to get home? Robert walked down to D-Dock to get a better look at the empty slip. That's when he noticed something that made his stomach clench with worry. Jake's life jacket was hanging on the dock cleat, along with his boat keys and his cell phone, all secured in a waterproof bag. No experienced boater, and Jake was definitely experienced, would take a boat out without a life jacket. And leaving keys and phone behind? That didn't make sense under any circumstances. Robert immediately tried calling Jake's cell phone, even though it was right there on the dock. The phone rang and buzzed in its waterproof case, confirming what Robert already knew: Jake wasn't answering because Jake didn't have his phone. Fighting a growing sense of panic, Robert called the Vermont State Police. The dispatcher took his information calmly, but Robert could hear the concern in her voice as he described the situation. Within 20 minutes, a patrol car pulled into the marina parking lot, followed shortly by a boat from the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. Officer Sarah Chen was the first responder, a 10-year veteran of the state police who had handled her share of water-related incidents. She spoke with Robert carefully, taking detailed notes about the previous evening and Jake's typical behavior patterns. "You said he was working on the boat last night," Officer Chen said, consulting her notepad. "Did he seem upset about anything? Distracted? Different from usual?" Robert shook his head. Jake was completely normal. Actually, he seemed excited about his research project. We talked about the best spots for collecting samples, and he was looking forward to getting out on the water. Officer Chen examined Jake's belongings on the dock. The life jacket, keys, and phone were arranged neatly, not scattered or dropped in haste. It looked almost deliberate, as if someone had carefully placed them there. Meanwhile, Fish and Wildlife Officer Tom Bradley was preparing to search the immediate waters around the marina. The fog was beginning to lift slightly, but visibility was still limited to perhaps a quarter-mile. If Jake's boat was out there somewhere, it might be difficult to spot from shore. Any idea which direction he might have headed? Officer Bradley asked Robert. "He mentioned wanting to collect samples from different depths," Robert replied. "Could be anywhere, really." Jake knew the lake well, he'd been out dozens of times this summer. By 8 a.m., additional resources were arriving. The Vermont State Police Marine Unit launched their patrol boat, and the Coast Guard station in Burlington was notified. What had started as a routine welfare check was rapidly escalating into a full search and rescue operation. Dr. Patricia Huang arrived at the marina around 8:30, as she often did on Friday mornings to check on her sailboat. She immediately noticed the police presence and approached Officer Chen with concern. "Is everything all right?" Dr. Huang asked. "I was here last night working on my boat. Has something happened?" Officer Chen explained the situation, and Dr. Huang's expression grew grave. "I remember Jake," she said. "He was still working when I left around 8:30. Seemed perfectly fine, we even waved to each other." "Did you notice anything else?" Officer Chen asked. "Any other people around? Other boats moving?" Dr. Huang thought carefully. "There was a car in the parking lot when I left. Dark-colored, maybe a sedan. I didn't pay much attention to it, but I remember thinking it was unusual because most people don't come to marinas that late unless they're boat owners." This detail aligned with Robert's observations from the previous evening. Officer Chen made careful notes, already beginning to piece together a timeline of events. As the morning progressed, the search expanded. Coast Guard helicopters joined the effort, their rotors cutting through the gradually clearing air as they swept back and forth across the vast expanse of Lake Champlain. The lake stretches over 120 miles from north to south, with countless coves, islands, and hidden areas where a small boat could potentially be found. But hours passed with no sign of Jake Morrison or his boat. The fog lifted completely by noon, revealing crystal-clear water and perfect visibility in all directions. If the boat had been anywhere near the marina, the searchers would have found it. That's when everyone began to realize this wasn't a simple case of someone getting lost or experiencing boat trouble. Something had happened to Jake Morrison, and whatever it was, it had happened sometime between 9:30 Thursday evening and 6:30 Friday morning. The peaceful marina had become a crime scene, and a young man's disappearance had become Burlington's most perplexing mystery. By Friday afternoon, the missing person case had attracted the attention of Detective Lieutenant Michael Torres, a 20-year veteran of criminal investigations who specialized in complex cases. Detective Torres was known throughout Vermont law enforcement for his methodical approach and his ability to find patterns that others missed. The first thing Detective Torres did was establish a command post at the marina, using Robert Kellerman's office as a base of operations. He wanted to be close to the scene, to feel the rhythm of the place and understand how events might have unfolded. "Tell me about Jake Morrison," Detective Torres said to Robert, settling into a chair across from the marina manager's desk. "Not just as a boat renter, but as a person. What was he like?" Robert considered the question carefully. "Jake was one of the good ones," he said finally. "Polite, responsible, genuinely interested in the water and the environment. He'd been renting dock space all summer, and I never had a single problem with him. Paid his fees on time, kept his boat clean, followed all the rules." "Any enemies? Conflicts with other boat owners or marina users?" "None that I'm aware of," Robert replied. "Jake got along with everyone. He was the kind of kid who would help you tie up your boat if he saw you struggling, or offer to share his tools if you needed something." Detective Torres made notes while they talked, but his eyes constantly scanned the marina layout, absorbing details about sight lines, access points, and potential hiding spots. The marina was well lit, but there were still plenty of shadows where someone could conceal themselves after dark. "Let's talk about that car Dr. Huang mentioned," Detective Torres said. "Dark sedan, parked here Thursday evening. Any idea who it might have belonged to?" Robert shook his head. "I noticed it too, but didn't get a good look. It wasn't blocking anything, so I didn't approach it. Wish I had now." Detective Torres interviewed Dr. Huang next, hoping to extract more details about her observations from Thursday evening. Dr. Huang was precise and thoughtful, the kind of witness investigators dream about. "I left my boat around 8:30, she told Detective Torres. "As I walked to my car, I saw Jake still working on his boat. He had a headlamp on and was doing something near the engine, cleaning or maintenance work." "Did you speak with him?" "Just a friendly wave. I called out, 'Good night,' and he waved back. Nothing unusual about the interaction." "Tell me more about this dark car." Dr. Huang closed her eyes, trying to recall details. "It was parked near the marina entrance, maybe a sedan or small SUV. I remember thinking it was odd because most people don't come to marinas that late unless they're boat owners, and I know most of the regular boat owners by sight." "Could you see anyone inside the car?" "No, the windows seemed tinted, or maybe it was just the lighting. I got the impression there might have been people inside, but I couldn't see clearly." Detective Torres spent the rest of Friday interviewing anyone who had been at or near the marina on Thursday evening. He spoke with restaurant workers from nearby establishments, joggers who used the lakefront path, and residents of the apartment complex that overlooked the marina. Most interviews yielded little useful information, but one conversation proved intriguing. Maria Santos, who worked the evening shift at a waterfront restaurant called The Boathouse, remembered serving a couple Thursday night who had seemed unusually interested in the marina. "They sat at our outside table with the best view of the docks," Maria told Detective Torres. "Ordered drinks and appetizers, but spent most of their time looking toward the marina with binoculars. Said they were birdwatching, but it seemed strange at night." "Can you describe them?" "Man and woman, both looked to be in their 30s or 40s. Well dressed, polite, paid in cash. The woman had short dark hair, and the man wore a baseball cap. They left around 10 p.m. Detective Torres felt his investigative instincts sharpen. Birdwatching at night was certainly unusual, and the timing aligned perfectly with Jake Morrison's disappearance window. "Did they ask any questions about the marina or the people who use it?" Maria thought for a moment. "Actually, yes. The woman asked if I knew what time the marina usually closed, and whether people often worked on their boats late into the evening. I thought she was just making conversation. By Saturday morning, Detective Torres had developed several working theories. The most straightforward possibility was that Jake had decided to take his boat out for some reason, perhaps to check on his research equipment or to meet someone, and had encountered some kind of accident or foul play on the water. But the evidence didn't support this theory. Jake's life jacket, keys, and phone had been left behind deliberately, not scattered in panic. And experienced boaters simply didn't venture onto large bodies of water without essential safety equipment. The second possibility was more troubling. Someone had taken Jake and his boat against his will. This would explain the missing vessel and the carefully arranged belongings left on the dock. But who would target a college student researching water quality? And why take the boat instead of simply leaving the scene? Detective Torres requested Jake's phone records, bank statements, and university files. He also asked the Coast Guard to expand their search pattern, focusing on remote coves and islands where a boat might be hidden. If someone had taken Jake and his vessel, they would need a secluded location to avoid detection. Meanwhile, Jake's family arrived from Albany, New York. His parents, David and Linda Morrison, were devastated but determined to help with the search efforts. They described Jake as a dedicated student with no history of risky behavior or involvement with dangerous people. "Jake called us every Sunday," Linda Morrison told Detective Torres through tears. "He was excited about finishing his thesis and starting graduate school. He had plans, Detective. He had a future. This doesn't make any sense." David Morrison, a software engineer, had been trying to track his son's digital footprint. "Jake's social media accounts show nothing unusual," he reported. His last posts were about his research project and looking forward to the weekend. No indication of any problems or concerns. As the weekend progressed, the case began attracting media attention. Local news stations ran stories about the missing student, and Jake's photo appeared on social media with pleas for information. The University of Vermont issued a statement expressing concern for Jake's welfare and offering support to his family. But despite the publicity and the intensive search efforts, no new leads emerged. Jake Morrison and his boat had simply vanished from Lake Champlain, leaving behind only questions and a growing sense that something dark had invaded the peaceful Vermont community. Detective Torres stood on the marina dock Sunday evening, watching the sun set over the water where Jake had last been seen. Somewhere out there, answers were waiting. The challenge was finding them before the trail grew cold and the mystery became just another unsolved case in the files. On Monday morning, Detective Torres received the phone records he'd requested, and what he found changed the entire direction of the investigation. Jake Morrison had received 3 phone calls on Thursday evening, all from the same number, all lasting less than 30 seconds. The number belonged to a cell phone registered to a Jennifer Walsh of Montreal, Canada. When Detective Torres called the number, he reached a disconnected line. Further investigation revealed that Jennifer Walsh had reported her phone stolen 2 weeks before Jake's disappearance. This discovery suggested a level of premeditation that made Detective Torres deeply uneasy. Someone had specifically targeted Jake Morrison, using an untraceable phone to make contact before his disappearance. The random crime theory was rapidly becoming less plausible. Detective Torres drove to the University of Vermont campus to dig deeper into Jake's academic life. Jake's thesis advisor, Professor Elizabeth Coleman, was an expert in aquatic ecology who had known Jake for 2 years. "Jake was one of my most promising students," Professor Coleman told Detective Torres in her cluttered office overlooking the campus green. His research on microplastic contamination in Lake Champlain was groundbreaking. He'd identified pollution sources that nobody else had documented. Could his research have put him in conflict with anyone? Professor Coleman hesitated. Well, Jake's findings were potentially embarrassing to certain local businesses. He'd traced microplastic contamination to several industrial sources, including a textile plant and a marina supply company. His data was very thorough and very damning. Detective Torres felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to align. Did Jake plan to publish these findings? That was the plan. His thesis defense was scheduled for early October, and he was hoping to get his research published in a major environmental journal. Jake believed his work could lead to significant changes in local pollution regulations. This revelation opened up entirely new avenues of investigation. Detective Torres requested copies of Jake's research files and began compiling a list of businesses and individuals who might be affected by his findings. Meanwhile, the search for Jake's boat continued across Lake Champlain's vast expanse. The Coast Guard had expanded their efforts to include remote areas near the Canadian border, using sonar equipment to scan underwater areas where a boat might have been scuttled. On Tuesday morning, the search team made their first significant discovery. Coast Guard divers found Jake's boat in 60 feet of water near Burton Island, about 12 miles north of the marina. The vessel had been deliberately sunk, its drain plugs had been removed and the hull had been punctured in several places. But Jake Morrison was not in the boat. Detective Torres arrived at the dive site within an hour, watching as the Coast Guard team carefully raised the waterlogged vessel. Even from a distance, he could see that the boat showed signs of having been thoroughly cleaned before it was sunk. Whoever did this knew what they were doing, Coast Guard Captain Rebecca Mitchell told Detective Torres as they examined the recovered boat. This wasn't random vandalism. Someone systematically destroyed evidence and then disposed of the boat in a location where it might never have been found. The boat's interior had been stripped of anything that might contain DNA evidence or fingerprints. Jake's research equipment was gone, his water sample containers were missing, and even the boat's registration papers had been removed. But the perpetrators had made one crucial mistake. Hidden beneath the boat's battery compartment, investigators found Jake's backup research drive, a small waterproof device that contained copies of all his environmental data. Detective Torres felt a surge of hope as he held the drive. If Jake's research had motivated his disappearance, this device might contain the key to solving the case. That evening, Detective Torres met with a computer forensics expert to examine the contents of Jake's backup drive. What they discovered was explosive. Jake's research had identified not just general pollution sources, but specific dates and quantities of illegal dumping activities. His data showed that several local businesses had been secretly disposing of industrial waste in Lake Champlain for years, violating numerous environmental protection laws. Most disturbing of all, Jake's files indicated that he had been in contact with someone inside one of the companies, an anonymous source who had been providing him with internal documents and disposal schedules. "Look at this," the forensics expert said, pointing to a series of encrypted files. Jake was building a comprehensive case. He had photographs, chemical analysis results, and what appears to be financial records showing payments made to cover up the dumping activities. Detective Torres studied the data with growing amazement. Jake Morrison hadn't just been a graduate student collecting water samples, he had been conducting a serious environmental investigation that threatened to expose a network of corporate crime. The encrypted files contained names, dates, and locations that read like a roadmap to environmental corruption. Several prominent Burlington businesses were implicated, along with individuals in positions of authority who had apparently been paid to look the other way. But one name in Jake's files made Detective Torres pause. Thomas Brennan, listed as TB, primary contact inside Lakeside Industries, was also identified as security consultant in several of Jake's more recent entries. Detective Torres ran Thomas Brennan's name through police databases and discovered a troubling history. Brennan was a former military contractor with expertise in surveillance and problem-solving for corporate clients. He had been investigated twice for assault charges that were later dropped, and his current employer, Lakeside Industries, was prominently featured in Jake's pollution research. The picture was becoming clearer, and it was far more sinister than a simple missing person case. Jake Morrison had stumbled onto something much larger than microplastic contamination. He had uncovered a network of environmental crime involving powerful people who had both the motive and the means to make problems disappear. As Detective Torres drove home through the quiet Vermont countryside, he realized that Jake's disappearance was likely just the beginning. If Jake had indeed been silenced for his research, then others involved in the investigation, including Detective Torres himself, might also be in danger. The peaceful surface of Lake Champlain hid more than just sunken boats and missing students. It concealed secrets that powerful people would kill to protect. Wednesday morning brought an unexpected break in the case. Detective Torres received a call from Dr. Patricia Huang, the pediatrician who had been at the marina on Thursday evening. "Detective, I think I may have seen something important," Dr. Huang said, her voice tight with tension. "I've been having trouble sleeping, going over that night in my mind, and I remembered something." Detective Torres met Dr. Huang at her medical office, noting that she looked exhausted and worried. She led him to a quiet conference room and closed the door carefully. "That dark car I mentioned," she began. "I remember now, it had Quebec license plates. And when I was walking to my own car, I saw someone get out of the passenger side. A woman with short dark hair, just like that couple at the restaurant described." Detective Torres felt his pulse quicken. "Did you see her face?" "Not clearly, but I remember thinking she moved like someone who was athletic, confident. She walked toward the marina docks after I drove away." This new information aligned perfectly with the timeline Detective Torres had been constructing. The mysterious couple at the restaurant, the stolen phone calls to Jake, and now confirmation that someone had approached the marina around the time of Jake's disappearance. Detective Torres immediately contacted Canadian authorities to request information about the Quebec-plated vehicle. Within hours, he had a partial match: a dark blue sedan registered to a numbered company in Montreal that specialized in corporate security services. Meanwhile, the investigation into Lakeside Industries was yielding disturbing results. Financial records showed large payments to Thomas Brennan's security consulting firm, payments that coincided with dates when Jake's research indicated illegal dumping activities had occurred. More troubling still, Detective Torres discovered that Lakeside Industries had been quietly purchasing land around Lake Champlain through shell companies, apparently trying to control access points where their dumping activities might be observed. Detective Torres decided it was time to bring Thomas Brennan in for questioning. But when officers arrived at Brennan's address, they found the house empty and clearly abandoned in haste. Neighbors reported seeing moving trucks the previous evening. The investigation was closing in, but the primary suspects were already running. Thursday brought another significant development. The FBI contacted Detective Torres to inform him that Jake Morrison's case was connected to a larger federal investigation into environmental crimes across the northeastern United States. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez arrived from the FBI's Burlington office with a team of specialists and a wealth of information that put Jake's disappearance into a much broader context. "We've been tracking this network for 2 years," Agent Rodriguez told Detective Torres in a secure conference room at the state police headquarters. "Lakeside Industries is just one node in a much larger operation that involves illegal waste disposal, environmental cover-ups, and corporate intimidation across multiple states." She spread out a map showing locations across Vermont, New York, and Quebec where similar activities had been documented. Jake Morrison wasn't their first victim, Detective. 3 other environmental researchers have disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances in the past 18 months. Detective Torres studied the map with growing horror. "Are you saying Jake was murdered?" "We believe so, yes. The pattern is consistent. Researchers identify illegal activities, they're contacted by anonymous sources offering inside information, and then they disappear before they can publish their findings." Agent Rodriguez showed Detective Torres photographs of the other victims: Dr. Sarah Chen, a water quality specialist from Albany who had been found dead in her laboratory with her research destroyed, Marcus Thompson, a graduate student from Montreal whose boat had been found empty on the St. Lawrence River, and Professor Jennifer Walsh, whose name had been used on the stolen phone that contacted Jake. "They're using real victims' identities to set up meetings with new targets," Agent Rodriguez explained. "Jennifer Walsh was the first to die, 18 months ago. They've been using her stolen identity ever since." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. What had begun as a simple missing person case had revealed a network of environmental crime that spanned international borders and involved millions of dollars in illegal activities. But knowing the scale of the problem didn't bring Detective Torres any closer to finding Jake Morrison, or what remained of him. "Do you think Jake is still alive?" Detective Torres asked. Agent Rodriguez's expression was grim. "Based on the pattern with other victims, it's unlikely. But we haven't given up hope. Jake was more careful than the others, he created backup files, he documented everything, and he may have had contingency plans we don't know about yet." That afternoon, Detective Torres received a call that changed everything. A marina worker from a small facility near the Canadian border reported finding something unusual washed up on shore, a waterproof bag containing personal items and a handwritten note. Detective Torres drove north immediately, his heart pounding as he considered the possibilities. The marina worker, an elderly man named Frank Dubois, led him to a rocky shoreline where debris occasionally washed up from the lake. "Found it this morning," Frank said, pointing to a yellow waterproof bag that had been carefully secured with multiple zip ties. "Figured it might be important, what with all the news about that missing student." Detective Torres opened the bag with gloved hands, finding Jake Morrison's university ID, his research notes, and a handwritten letter addressed to "Whoever finds this." The letter was brief but chilling. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to me. I discovered evidence of illegal dumping that goes much deeper than I initially thought. I was contacted by someone claiming to work inside Lakeside Industries, but I now believe it was a trap. I'm hiding backup copies of my research in 3 locations. Tell my parents I love them, and please don't let these people get away with destroying our lake." The letter included specific directions to the hidden research caches, locations where Jake had apparently stashed additional evidence before his disappearance. Detective Torres felt a mixture of admiration and sadness as he read Jake's final message. Even facing danger, the young man had been thinking about protecting his research and ensuring the truth would eventually come to light. As the sun set over Lake Champlain, Detective Torres realized that Jake Morrison's disappearance had become something much larger than a criminal investigation. It had become a battle for environmental justice, a fight against corporate corruption, and a race to prevent more victims from suffering Jake's fate. The quiet waters of the lake held many secrets, but Jake Morrison had made sure that the most important truths would eventually surface. Over the following weeks, the joint FBI and Vermont State Police investigation moved rapidly. Using Jake Morrison's hidden research caches and the evidence he had carefully preserved, investigators built an airtight case against the environmental crime network. Thomas Brennan was arrested at the Canadian border trying to flee to Europe. Under interrogation, he eventually revealed the location where Jake Morrison's body had been disposed of, a remote section of the lake where industrial waste had been illegally dumped for years. The recovery operation was both tragic and symbolic. Jake's body was found weighted down in the same waters he had been trying to protect through his research. Even in death, he had become part of the environmental story he had dedicated his life to telling. But Jake's death was not in vain. The evidence he had gathered led to the largest environmental crime prosecution in Vermont's history. Lakeside Industries was shut down, its executives faced criminal charges, and new regulations were implemented to prevent similar activities. More importantly, Jake's research became the foundation for a comprehensive cleanup effort that would restore Lake Champlain's water quality for future generations. Detective Torres attended Jake's funeral in Albany, where hundreds of people gathered to honor a young man who had died trying to protect the environment. Jake's parents established a scholarship fund for environmental research students, ensuring that their son's passion for protecting natural resources would inspire others. Dr. Patricia Huang became an advocate for marina security, working with law enforcement to establish better communication protocols and surveillance systems. She also continued Jake's research, publishing his findings posthumously in a major environmental journal. The marina at Cedar Point was never quite the same. Robert Kellerman installed additional security measures and created a memorial plaque honoring Jake Morrison's dedication to environmental protection. Visitors to the marina often pause to read the plaque and remember the young man who had given his life trying to keep their waters clean. Agent Rodriguez continued working on similar cases across the region, using Jake's investigation methods to identify and stop other environmental crime networks. She often said that Jake Morrison had taught her more about thorough research and careful documentation than any training course ever could. Detective Torres kept a photo of Jake on his desk, a reminder that even seemingly simple cases could reveal deep truths about courage, corruption, and the price of protecting what matters most. The dark sedan with Quebec plates was eventually found abandoned in Montreal, its occupants having fled to countries without extradition treaties. But their network was broken, their operations exposed, and their ability to harm other researchers was eliminated. Lake Champlain began to heal. Water quality improved as illegal dumping stopped and cleanup efforts progressed. Fish populations recovered, and the lake's ecosystem slowly returned to its natural balance. On quiet evenings, when the mist rose from the water and the lights of Burlington twinkled across the lake, visitors to Cedar Point Marina could almost imagine they saw a young man working on his boat, preparing for one more research trip to protect the waters he loved. Jake Morrison's story became part of Vermont folklore, a reminder that one person's dedication to truth and environmental protection could make a difference, even at the ultimate cost. His research lived on, his sacrifice was not forgotten, and the lake he died trying to protect continued to provide beauty and recreation for countless others. The case officially closed, but its impact continued to ripple outward like waves across still water. Environmental researchers across the region adopted Jake's careful methods and security protocols. Law enforcement agencies improved their coordination on environmental crimes. And communities around Lake Champlain became more vigilant about protecting their natural resources. In the end, Jake Morrison's disappearance had revealed a truth more important than any single crime, that ordinary people doing extraordinary work to protect the environment deserve our respect, our support, and our commitment to continuing their vital mission. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Jake's story, not as a tragedy, but as an inspiration. Remember that each of us has the power to protect the natural world around us, to speak truth to power, and to ensure that future generations inherit a cleaner, healthier planet. The waters of Lake Champlain continue to flow northward toward the St. Lawrence River and eventually to the Atlantic Ocean, carrying with them the memory of a young man who cared enough to risk everything for their protection. And somewhere in the gentle sound of water lapping against the docks of Cedar Point Marina, Jake Morrison's dedication to environmental justice lives on, inspiring others to continue the work he began and to never stop fighting for the truth. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.